E aí, tudo bem?
Tranquilo. So let me share the screen with you guys. I'm just gonna start from the presupposition that nothing was understandable last time, and that therefore this is just, let's say, the presentation yesterday was just like channel testing or something like that. But I'll go faster in the beginning anyway, just so we don't lose that much time. And I also hate kind of redoing stuff without adding anything. So please let me know if the connection starts getting bad. I can just go and kill myself and end it off. So as I said last time, this presentation is based on the work that was done for this book. And it's actually the 7th chapter of a book. It's supposed to be a slightly different chapter than the previous ones. That's why it can be kind of read separately. In fact, Thiago, who is here, helped me a lot with it. He gave it a read. He added some references. It was very, very helpful. I wouldn't know how. We added a bunch of stuff to the chapter that we really didn't know how to back it up. So we really needed somebody to take a look and see if we were going totally crazy.
You are far too kind, my friend.
No, but it really calmed me down when you said it was okay, because that was a bit, I mean, it's part of the problem of the book, or the sort of big stakes of the book, because our idea is to propose something that is quite ambitious. So we know we're going to get a lot of kind of trouble because of some of the propositions, but we also try to make sure that the trouble we get is useful. It's not just, let's say, because of our lack of care with defining or presenting things. So I just summarized this. I didn't have this yesterday, but I just added this here because I think it helps to summarize some of the basic discussions that we had before starting last time, which are sort of main theses that we are developing in the book and that justify what I'm going to present to you. So the first thesis is this general thesis that I mentioned yesterday. This idea that there is some process going on we call peripherization. It's not a hard term, it's been developed by many people, but that you can think of it as a sort of social tendency that makes the structure of peripheral social formations more adequate for contemporary capitalism. So there is something about the new patterns of accumulation, the new relation between unemployment and employment, between automation and chronic unemployment, between reserve army of labor and forms of consumption that are possible. There's a lot of conditions for financial contemporary capitalism, what some people call crisis capitalism or whatever you want to call it, that find a more adequate ground on the sort of strange, fractured, hybrid social formation that was already more common on peripheral countries in modernity than in advanced countries. So a consequence of this is that there is a tendency for the extension of those conditions throughout the globe rather than the inverse. So for example, we could assume, like we did for a long time, that capitalism thrives on places where there are impersonal, bureaucratic relations with a rational social structure, with some basic social security and some forms of freedom being guaranteed. So no wonder that the 20th century saw so many processes of independence, sovereignty, national struggle being backed up by a sort of liberal agenda, because after the independence happened, after some more civilized relations were possible, capitalism could thrive better, substituting slave relations for commercial relations, substituting personal favors and personal status for impersonal professional relations, substituting mythic forms of sociality for a disenchanted worldview. It seemed like capitalism thrived better on the second than on the first. So it seems that wherever capitalism is going, so if we're living under the monopoly form of capitalism, this sort of global domination under capitalism, the tendency is that that form of sociality, based on homogenization, uniformization, rationalization, instrumentalization, whatever you want to zation it, it's going to follow it together, right? And it's strange to see that after the 70s, after what's called a crisis of value, or the new patterns of relative surplus extraction, the new role of financial capitalism, the problems with the limits of capital accumulation under certain terms, that those hybrid forms of sociality, for example, where having part of your wealth coming through your wage, but part of your conditions of living coming from communal self-construction. So my wages pay for my direct consumption of commodities, but the housing, health, all of that comes from illegal neighborhood-like organization of people. That actually works better for a moment where you're increasing the level of unemployment, you're decreasing the necessity or the rate between necessary and surplus labor. Some things that looked like they were backwards forms of sociality start looking like the best technology for the most advanced capitalism. There is this famous Brazilian sociologist who I love very much, called Chico de Oliveira. He calls this the refunctioning of misery or of poverty. And he says that the best example of this is if you walk around, let's say, Rio de Janeiro, and you see people selling products on the streets. We call it shopping chão, like the ground shopping or the street shopping. And that form of commerce, it's very much associated with artisanal products, right? I'm gonna do something in my house, like something with clay, and I'm gonna sell it, or I'm gonna create something as an artisan, then I'm gonna sell it. But when you look at the shopping chão, that form of kind of backwards commerce is actually where people are selling computer chips, and they're selling pen drives, and they're selling computer parts, and they're selling products of the most advanced technological capitalism. So there is a perfect kind of a weird hybrid connection between the backward and the forward and the advanced, in such a way that the very idea of advancing doesn't make any sense. So for Chico de Oliveira, he called Brazil a platypus formation. He says Brazil is like a platypus in that it's at the same time functioning in more than one way, and it kind of puts a stop to any idea of classic teleological historical development, right? Can you guys hear me okay? I'm looking at Caron, and now I just look at—
Don't be paranoid.
I'm gonna be paranoid. There's no way now.
I'm usually thinking about what you're saying. I'm not.
Yeah, no way, man. Like today, I'm gonna be a bit paranoid. But you see this idea, like this is Chico de Oliveira's strongest thesis was there is no place to go. In the same way that when people saw the platypus, they used to think, like in 1600s, when they found like the bones of a platypus, that it probably was a transition animal between a sort of egg placing animal and a mammal, right? It was in between two periods. It was a transition form. But when Darwin actually saw a platypus, he had to conclude that there is no linear teleology in evolution, because both forms were coexisting, right, in one creature. And it made no sense to say that there is a necessary path anymore. And that's, let's say, an event for the platypus event for natural selection, because then you need a spatialized, temporalized description of the development of forms. You cannot accept that idea that one form necessarily moves towards another. So Chico de Oliveira says that shopping shown or the ground shopping is like the platypus. Once you see that, you recognize that there is nowhere to go. There is no future form. And
do people understand what a ground shopping is?
I mean, everyone who lives in the first world has seen this in some movie where they show third world people. We're always selling stuff in the ground.
And Dennis is there. I'm not sure if people know what a shopping show is.
Yeah, it's a very important concept. Everyone should know it. But if anyone can find an image of it on Google, it would be good.
Anyway, is it a street market?
Yeah, but it's not a regular street market. I mean, like people put like a blanket on the street, like this, right on the street, and then they put a lot of stuff here, which is like practically garbage, you know. But it's like doll heads and broken computer parts, and they sell it for cheap. But when you look at it, it's like it's the garbage of the most advanced capitalist production. It's not, let's say, old artisanal stuff that you would kind of mythify that we would be. Did somebody? Okay, great. Perfect.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, Chico de Oliveira is an important guy in this story, and I think that there is a very weird thing if you think about it, which is there is something called a theory of dependency, right? Which we developed. It's Rosa Luxemburg, Marx already mentioned, but Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Van Guter, Frank, and a bunch of guys in Brazil and elsewhere developed this idea of how advanced countries kind of hold less advanced countries in check and benefit from their backwardness, right? But the thesis of peripherization is a development of that, because it suggests that there is a relation between advanced and backward countries, right? Like this, you could say this is advanced and this is backward. But this idea that these guys are piling this, right? And that this is moving forward towards a better advancement. This idea starts going down. And the more they pile and they extract from subdeveloped countries, actually the more they bring together the technology of underdeveloped. So it's a ironic, sorry, let me put it like this. It's an ironic consequence of development and undeveloped countries, where rather than just piling and extracting, plundering materials and wealth from undeveloped countries and bringing to the development world, they're also plundering technology. Right? They're also, sorry, just 1 second. They're also bringing the very way that these social formations work and reproducing here. Not necessarily because they want to, but because it's the only way to keep the patterns of accumulation going and to manage surplus population and to deal with the discontent of the break of the welfare state and to organize the relation between legality and illegality and to make sure that the state and capitalism still have a positive relation. So it's not only that you extract wealth, but you kind of extract the very mode of organization from the periphery, right? So that's a way of understanding this thesis. So our first claim based on this is that this process of peripherization affects not only the social terrain, but also the effectivity and general conditions for leftist organization and theory. And the way we understand this conditioning, or how this changes the left, is that our thesis that we didn't account for the left's dependence on a certain homogenization process that the 20th century saw, right? So imperialism, for us, people who claim that we live in imperialist times are optimists, because imperialism suggests that at least as long as capitalism is winning, it is spreading around the world the conditions for something new as well. The more that it treats everyone uniformly, the more that it homogenizes society, the more that it makes society have a common form, the more we can politicize that form, the more people who speak different languages, come from different places, suffer from the same thing, the more the politicization of that suffering can become something new, right? So there was a certain dependence on this homogenization. And our first problem is suggest that when you break with that claim, when you see how social formations happen in the periphery and that they don't have that homogeneity, right? They are fractured and they are like a platypus, which is not a homogeneous, formally homogeneous animal, right? Everything in that, all the parts of that animal are enveloped only by the species or the type of the animal. Actually, it seems like it's being pulled apart by two strands at the same time. Once you accept that as your basic condition, two things fall to the earth that you can no longer accept. The first thing that this fracturing has consequences for political organization and systemic political strategy, because, well, what's the classic schema we have? It's something that Badiou calls the transitivity of politics. It's the idea that I have a society, there is a small part in this society, for example, industrial workers, who represent the interest of the society as a whole. If I organize this element, I will change all these other points by transitivity. If something is new for this part, it will be new for all these parts as well. It's guaranteed. If I change the world for the strong part, or the important part, or the part that represents more than itself, that has a direct, immanent connection to the whole or to the common, I will be affecting everything, right? In another way, it is also said to be the part from which I can evaluate if other parts are going in the same direction. So I know that this is the right way to go. So if these guys are going this way, I know that all of this will point better to this direction, right? Because I have a perspective on the whole situation. Whereas when I don't have a position, I can't really tell necessarily how these other things would compose together, and if their resultant would be increasing or decreasing our power, right? So the first point is that once you undo this thesis, it becomes hard to know what are the important symptoms of society, which ones are not, right? And there are many. I try to suggest very briefly, because the connection was cutting, that we know two contemporary attempts to save this. And they're both coming from the periphery, in fact, right? Both the autonomism project is very much grounded on outer modernity, on a sort of critique of European, Anglo-Saxon political thinking, and attempting to recast that in a new way, very much connected, for example, with Latin America and so on. But populism as well has that same Argentinian, in fact, feel. It comes very much from Laclau's theory of what was going on in Latin America. And both populism, I try to suggest, and this autonomist process, both of them assume that even though capitalism doesn't guarantee this anymore, something else does. So capitalism is all fragmented. Laclau will say there is no social ontology, there is no society, there is no part of capital which is more important than any other, so we cannot start from political economy. But, as I said, the social demands, because they are demands, they are homogeneous amongst each other. So if I coordinate what people want, so if I coordinate what doesn't exist, what people wish to exist, let me just write this in an understandable way. If I coordinate demands, they are homogeneous. So the set of all indignations against capitalism is a consistent set, right? Or all resistances against capital, all demands against capitalism point in the same direction, same fundamental direction. I can bind them together in a consistent orientation. And we think that the autonomist project starts from a similar position. It says, Social demands, no, there is no such thing as a coherent demand because capitalism invents lack, and we shouldn't focus on the negative, on lack. We should focus on affirmation and cooperation and so on. But because all cooperation and resistance is social, it's social life itself, it is equally homogeneous. So the struggle of workers in a city, the struggle of Black movement somewhere else, the struggle of women somewhere else, they by necessity, since they are struggles against capitalism, they are compatible in themselves, right? And our claim is that neither because of discourse articulating demands, nor because resistance articulates social life, we can guarantee that things go together. So our claim is that this process of peripherization actually affects the terrain for politics much more than simply say, let's find the new revolutionary subject. Now the unemployed are the revolutionary subject, or now every local movement will compose globally. Nothing guarantees the transitivity between local fractures and global change. I think that's a way of saying it, right? So that affects how you organize and how you strategize, because not only is this problem of fragmentation more serious than just let's get together because we are one, but also the conditions in the periphery are very different than the conditions for that establish the political tradition we are used to, which was established at least in connection with the advanced capitalist center, right? So for example, one way of thinking that is saying capitalism is somewhere, it organizes and puts into uniform and makes it so that people from different places are now occupying a similar place. They know better than their capitalist employers how a factory is run. They could run it by themselves. And so they have the knowledge, they are homogeneous amongst each other, and they are suffering under capitalism. Well, if we have a trade union that politicizes that suffering, we can use the knowledge they already have, we can use the cohesion that they already have and point it somewhere else. So capitalism does the logistics, we do the politicization. That's the basic idea. And our thesis is that in peripheral situations, nobody does the logistics. Like everyone does a bit of the logistics. Like if you read Anna Singh or some anthropologists of supply chain capitalism, right? Analysis of capitalism that take into consideration the concrete logistics across fractured spaces. You see that there is no common ground, and there is no logistics that could bind the people in these different areas. They don't speak the same language. Capitalism doesn't mean the same thing for them. They don't suffer similarly. They don't have anything in common. They do resist and have their own ways of doing it. But for example, if you go to a mine in Siberia, you will see that male chauvinism is a way of resisting the humiliation of labor. And if you go to Moscow, just next door, male chauvinism is the biggest problem, like transphobia and things like this. Both are oppressed, but they're totally incompatible. You cannot go to the mines in Siberia and tell people, hey guys, could you tone down the chauvinism? You know, just find another way of pretending like you're not just humiliated, oppressed slaves, but actually strong male people. You know, there is no way of removing that. So how the hell do you bring these things together? Capitalism didn't uniformalize everyone. It didn't make it so that the conditions on the mine work, the conditions on the service industry and cultural work are all the same. Nothing binds these people. There is only the minimal logistics for commodities to circulate. But capitalism only needed to provide the logistics for people to circulate while absolute surplus value was at the center. The moment that labor can be extracted without the laborers being organized, I can organize surplus labor without organizing laborers. They don't do it. Why create formal category of telemarketing workers when I can extract work from telemarketing people without giving them any formal category? I mean, why go the extra mile if they can work from different places? They only need to know how to use a computer. They don't need to know the specifics of anything. So the more disqualified, the more on the verge of unemployment, the more substitutable the worker is, the less I need to bargain with them, the less I need to guarantee some basic condition, the less social homogeneity between workers is necessary. So I like to think of this as a sort of weird thesis that capitalism organizes labor and not laborers anymore. Under a certain moment of technological advancement, informational revolution, and so on, you can organize labor, you can extract surplus labor without organizing laborers, right? And then people organize themselves in whatever way they can. So I would say that for political organization, there is this very big issue of logistics and social reproduction, which were not classic leftist themes because they were supposedly the very thing that capitalism gave us for granted. Logistics, whatever is written here. So suddenly these things become politically relevant as a sort of pre-political work. You need to kind of prepare the ground for politicization because there is nothing to politicize before that. Plus, you cannot count on this sort of what we call political transitivity. Because nothing guarantees that all these struggles amount to a bigger struggle. If A leads to B, B leads to C, that doesn't mean that A leads to C. That's not guaranteed, right? It's a weirder political space. But not only that, and following here what Frederick Jameson develops, our idea is that under this peripherization, so these hybrid social formations, they're not like one way. It's not like everywhere is the same. It's like a new imperialism of the periphery. It is like a hybrid splitting of every place into a dual city, like Mike Davis talks about, new and singular processes of population control everywhere. So we don't really know how to map the world in this situation. So our third point is that it's not a matter of adapting what we knew about the world from 20th century to the 21st and just include this thing. Well, we simply need to remap the whole thing again, right? And the way that Frederick Jameson argues this that I find very beautiful is that he says market capitalism, so capitalism as it was establishing itself, the social structure was of the same size of individual experience. So when the very beginning of capitalism, no wonder that in aesthetics you have a sort of realist tendency. It's not a matter of describing a bigger world, it's just a matter of describing a world without transcendence. So you still only depend on the commerce around the corner, some manufacturers, you need to go to another city to buy stuff. But the world is pretty much the same size. You can know the social structure by walking around. So capitalism aesthetically only imposes the problem of realism, which is redescribing the world without assuming that there is a transcendental rule. So that's like market capitalism. With imperialist capitalism, which would be the 20th century, the structure of the world is no longer the size of your experience. So you have the sort of modernist aesthetics, which is saying, look, everything that gives itself to my experience immediately, I know it's not true. Because the structure of experience is too big for experience. I know that I depend on the tea that is made in India. I know that a pencil goes through 4 factories before arriving at my table. It's impossible to have the experience of everything that I depend on. But there is one thing that's very important, which is the idea that that structure that is larger than your experience, it is one structure. That's why the modernist aesthetics is both aesthetics of trust the form, not the experience, break with the immediate, try new forms, but it's very much a trust in the form. Like if you find the one right form, you can capture the totality, you can capture the structure. And for Frederick Jameson, this sort of late capitalism or crisis capitalism, not only do you have a break between structure and experience, but you have a break inside the structure. So it's not only that you have one structure different from experience in scale and complexity, but you have multiple structures that are also competing amongst each other. So you cannot trust one form to lead you to the whole, because the totality itself is fractured. It's not only that it is separated from you, it's separated from itself. So if you come up with some formal means to go beyond your experience, it's still inauthentic. It's still assuming that what exists beyond you has the form of a unity, or again, a homogeneous form, right? Just to clarify here, just to make it a bit bigger. So you have a structure that is different from a different structure, and both these things are different from your experience, right? So this would be late capitalism. And this makes sense to call this the peripherization thesis, because again, it has to do with fractured social spaces where structure itself is not homogeneous. You cannot take a part and learn about the whole, because there is no direct transitivity between the parts, right? So how do you map this space? Because all the theoretical technology of the left was developed for this. This is what we call scientific socialism. The socialism that trusted law and form and tendency to describe a totality that is bigger than us. But how can you describe a totality that no particular part of it gives you access to the whole? I cannot look at industrial workers and say, see, this encapsulates the capitalist experience, because that's not true. If I just look where they live better in Brazil, for example. An industrial worker in Brazil is like middle-class guy, in average, right? Compare him to people who are living in much worse conditions and perhaps have jobs that look better, like less oppressed by the factory or whatever. Like, you don't know where to assume a position that sees everything from one place. And it's amazing, because if you take it like early 80s, or Jameson marks the beginning of postmodernism, that's the beginning of multimedia art as a serious endeavor, right? That's 60s to 70s, 80s. The idea that there is no one material, one medium that grasps the structure. You need somehow to pluralize. You need multiple perspectives. You need multiple visions. I mean, the idea of multiple perspectives pretty much explodes into philosophy. Everyone now tries to work around it, right? So how do you map totality under those conditions? So you see, like, our problem, our bad news is, because we depended on this homogenization, we don't know how to organize logistics, we don't know how to compose forces, and we don't know how to map a peripheral social formation, right? That's why we add here this three theses: to rethink the left without the homogeneity thesis, to reconsider what strategy and organization look like under these conditions, and to recompose our categorical framework so that a new mapping of the social space is possible. One that doesn't presuppose homogeneity, which itself makes us think that we know how to organize and how to think our strategy. So that's, let's say, the big background of everything we're doing. And I think that it's important to consider these three theses together, because part of our project, and I think that it is very much in dialogue with what we've been discussing here, is both to talk about strategy and organization, and reframing theory. So that's why the connection between these two things is a sort of experimental dimension to organization, right? To say we need to have tools that help us so that when we try stuff and we fail or succeed, that it further informs our theory because we don't know where we're stepping. So it makes no sense to talk about modeling in the sense that scientific socialism will talk about it. Like, there is a reality, an appearance. We know the form below it. So we can tell apart good and bad ideas. And we can now distinguish this from something new. It's not new with regards to this, because this is what utopian socialism did, right? Utopian socialism, it just looked at a market and it said, I'll be outside of the market in the forest. Now I'm outside of capitalism. Scientific socialism said, but if you look at the form and the laws of value, you know that there is no way out. Your thing that looked outside is actually inside. So it's only from this perspective that I can come up with something new, right? So the very description of capitalism defines what would be a new mod, a new idea for communism or whatever. Our idea is different. Our idea is there is this terrain. We have no idea what the fuck is going on. But if you create something artificial here, something might appear inside of it that tells you something about what's going on around you. So depending on what you do and how you organize, you might learn something about the world. And it's interesting to do it in such a way that as much as this thing starts to prop around, that we can actually connect them together. So you see, novelty actually emerges on top. It doesn't emerge after. That's also why we developed this idea. We use this actually in the outline, right? This idea that utopian socialism was based on the idea of outside. The novel is outside of capitalism. Then scientific socialism says there is no outside. If you look at the form is forever expanding. So the only place you can be is after. That's when the revolution will happen. After this, communism comes after what we're living. And this new thing we're trying to develop, it's not saying neither spatial metaphors nor temporal. Our idea is a scalar metaphor. It's about moving up, right? Or moving to a different scale of analysis. So novelty is not necessarily going to happen outside or after. It might happen above. Whatever above means here, because there is no aesthetics for this yet. So for example, you might conclude that you live in a capitalist world. Everyone around you is doing their own capitalist business, but you work in a cooperative. You know that on the other side of the world, somebody's buying the stuff you're doing, and somewhere else, somebody's doing something else. And from a different perspective, that cooperatives are close together and are part of the same space, right? Where is that space? It's neither outside nor after. It is kind of like above, right? But that's not the right word as well. But that's a sort of intuition we've been developing for how to think the place or the right aesthetics for communism under peripherization. It shouldn't be outside. There is no outside. It shouldn't be after, because we live in a platypus. There is no after the platypus. There is no evolution in the sense of necessary place to go. You can think perhaps at a different kind of resolution, right? Something like that.
Yeah, maybe instead of above, it's something like in between, right? Like if there's capitalist totality as the highest scale, then there is like the individual scale, something in between individuals and capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's a big question, because, for example, why am I not so happy with that word? Because first of all, I think it's a bit romanticized today. the idea is that you don't need to work around finding the form of something common, because fracture spaces, you can just live between fractures. So it's a sort of, in my opinion, it's a bit of a quietist, romantic view that forget totality, forget construction, you can be in between stuff. And I think that one thing we've been developing here as well is this idea that who said that capitalism is the highest scale you can get to? Capitalism is a scale where, from its perspective, if I have like a social formation that is fractured like this, right? And that, for example, everyone who lives here works here, right? This is Rio de Janeiro, like this is a slum, a favela, this is Leblon. Everyone leaves their houses in the morning, come work here, then come back to sleep here. The state only sees this part, it just manages this population. From the standpoint of capitalism, this has a lot of existence and this has very little existence. How good a resolution is capitalism if it depends on this fracturing and this differential, but it can't even properly name it? Perhaps a better revolution would actually see everything, right? See more. So I wouldn't be so kind of, I think it's a good problem. I don't know. I agree. Above is not a good idea, but in between is also perhaps not the best, because in between, to me, it suggests that we already have what we need in a certain way, you know? And above, at least that has the idea that perhaps we need something larger than capitalism in some sense, which I think even Karatani's idea has a bit of that, right? Of mode D is like mode A at a higher order scale, right? Something like that. I'm not sure if it makes sense, but that, yeah, that's a problem. I don't know how to answer that.
Gabriel, just one question.
Yeah.
Do you think it is similar to the position of transference in psychoanalysis? This position that you just said?
I like that idea just because I'm really into the idea that transference happens when, like, if I were to summarize what I think of transference is, people usually are counted like this, and some of their relations doesn't appear if you count them like this. Transference is a situation where you're counted like this. And dually, some things appear that they don't appear if you see people separately, right? So is transference happening above? Not exactly, but it's also not happening in between, because it's not about the relation between two people. So I think it's the same problem, I agree. But, you know, like, how do you name a change in place, which is not a change in time nor space? Right? And I think the zooming metaphor of above, or I think in between is nicer than, is because it has that idea of, like, you thought that this opposition here covered the whole space, but nothing prevents me from kind of stitching this in a different way, right? And dividing this space into some new thing. It's still covering the same space, but it's like re-stitching parts, right? I don't know. So I agree that there's something nice there, but it's even a good point, right? In my opinion, the communist problem of statics today is this: like, how do you take seriously the postmodern, whatever you want to call it, sort of challenge? Structures are not homogeneous. There is no one medium. There is a problem of the plurality of mediation, but you don't treat it purely as a problem of difference, heterogeneity. And what sort of a static category could name this sort of shift in the placing of, as like in terms of scaling, for example? I don't think scaling is, I also don't want to romanticize the issue, but I even think resolution is a better term than scale. Like, how do you name this change in resolution, right? You're no longer seeing things temporally or spatially, but time and space change because you're considering it from this other thing. It's a big issue. I really don't know. I wouldn't even know how to construct a canon of authors or painters or whatever who are interested in this. Like, it's a totally open issue, you know? Very exciting as well, I think. So all of this to say what is the context for what I'm presenting, right? This is, let's say, the fundamental diagnosis that is behind what we want to do. And based on what we discussed last time, at least what I understood from what you guys were saying, I know I was cutting everyone as well. I changed a bit this discussion just to add one thing to the modeling part. I don't have time to go into detail about it. I think that I'll try to do a presentation only on this later on. I know that Hans is studying something that goes in this direction as well, but what I added is the following. I presented to you this idea that models have two main senses, right? Being the representation and being the thing represented. I mentioned the way Badiou distinguishes three ideas, right? The notion of model as the sort of ideological distinction between things and names, or between abstractions and reality, where all abstraction is one side, all reality is on the other, and you're trying to, let's say, picture the world, right? But pictures are not in the world, and the world is not made of pictures. These things are kind of set apart, and you're trying to kind of recompose relations that are happening in a heterogeneous place, right? I think I have like a slide on this, like, right? So you have some relations on this side that are supposedly actual in reality, and on this other side you have mathematical abstractions, and you're trying to depict these things on your representative system or something like this, right? And Badiou distinguishes this from the proper concept of model, where he says, look, the issue is that in the places where modeling has a more productive function, both the syntax and the semantics, they're functionally distinguished. So to be a syntax or to be a semantical structure is not a qualitative or substantial distinction, where rules come from one domain of the world and meaning comes from another domain. Both syntax and semantics are made of the same stuff, they're just functionally distinguished. So, for example, you can take, I don't know, Frege, trying to understand a bit better what does the successor function mean in number theory, and then he moves to logic and tries to explain this, model it by talking about implication. He says, well, we can understand what a number is by understanding what implication is, or how concepts imply each other. But then you also have bool at the same time, or a bit earlier, I don't know exactly the timeline, right? And he's trying to understand what it means for A to imply B, B implies C, therefore A implies C, by looking at the fact that you can model this by saying this, right? C is inside of B, B is inside of A, therefore C is inside of A. So he's moving from logic to, I don't know, some algebraic stuff and some basic kind of inclusion relation. So what is the simple, like in this case, one thing is kind of giving us clarity over the other. But in the second case, the thing that gave the clarity is being clarified. There is no substantial place that things need to be in a modeling relation. It's not that things are represented by abstraction, something like this. If something will count as the model or not has more to do with the place it occupies in a relation than with substantial distinction, right? And then he talks about this to arrive at the category of model and saying, look, if you're trying to have a philosophical standpoint on modeling, you shouldn't be worried about modeling stuff. So rather than consider that there is, let's say, reality here and a model here, learn from the way the concept of model actually operates to look at modeling in the world as a part of reality relating to another part of reality. right? And your interest should rather be on the innovations that go into proposing new models rather than sticking to a model and saying that it's a description. So it becomes, let's say, a theory of the inventions of forms rather than the formal theory of what is out there. And I think that this is a good insight because we can use this for when we do a theory or a mapping in politics. Because in politics, we have this issue. How are we gonna create a new mapping that is itself political and it's not simply a sociological theory of political organization done from a sort of supposedly impartial standpoint? You need to be able to have, let's say, nice concepts to help you to think that you can have something going on, and this thing itself produces some new representation of itself, and that this whole process is an immanent process. It's done inside the element of politics. It's not done theoretically, totally disjunct from political reality. So using this, I try to, just give you a very brief description of modeling relation, but then I think Carol mentioned something about experimentation, right? And I suggested that, like even in physics, this is not really broken from, and even in, I don't know, physical experimentation, physical theories, you're not relating reality and theory, or reality and mathematics, or whatever. And I don't remember exactly how you remarked.
Yeah, but there's a further issue that I don't think we'll solve here, because the problem is when Badiou is saying that the thing is homogeneous to itself, like model and modeling are homogeneous, he's presupposing that some extraction have already been made. So the issue, the foundational issue about why reality is mathematizable is not addressed, right? So I think this is kind of the foundational issue that, logical positivism is worried about. So what if this is a gain in operationality? This is debatable. I kind of agree with you, but in the philosophical sense, it seems Badiou is only postponing a certain question, for me, at least.
Yeah, I think that question might be poorly formulated in the end. Like, what do you mean by reality when you say it's mathematical formalizable? Like, such specific things are mathematically formalizable. I'm not sure if you need to address it in such big, spectacular terms. It might make it much less treatable than formulating it in slightly different ways. And this actually leads me to the quotes that I brought them here just because it's just to show a thread that is not in the book. So it's not going to directly appear in what I'm going to present later, but it's something that connects what is in the book to things we've been doing. So I just added them here for the sake of this and for the sake of what you brought up now, Carol. One is from a famous philosopher of economy called Maki. It's very interesting. And he has this really cool text called Models Are Experiments, Experiments are Models, where he's trying to go against, in a certain sense, a certain doxa of economic modeling as, let's say, the basis for true scientific statements in economy, and trying to show that most economic models don't really live up to even to the category of models, but that other things do. His point, and I'm not going to read everything, but I'll leave the PDF for you guys later on, is that you shouldn't really, again, reproduce the distinction between modeling and experiment as being, or between formal systems and natural systems, as being a distinction in strong qualitative terms. Because his point is that ultimately models are experiments. All the basic characteristics of experiments are already present in theoretical models. But the difference is that they're both, let's say, organizations of something. The thing they are organizing is different. But the very basic idea is, so it says this, let me just see if we can find a good part of the quote. Yeah, so he's not saying that everything is, every model is an experiment. Many theoretical models are experiments, many material experiments are models. So we can talk about two kinds of models, theoretical and material models. So there are models.
For instance, you mentioned yesterday the dam in the Bay Area, right? That model.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to build a dam, and they did like a super huge model of the Bay Area in order to kind of reproduce what was going on. It was super huge because it's not, of course, as big as the Bay Area, but nevertheless, it needed to be of a certain magnitude in order to have the same properties or comparable properties to the target, right?
Yeah.
This is a good example. Yeah, in fact, this is a model, and it is an experiment at the same time. Like, you experiment on the model in order to see if it is feasible on the target material you want to do it. In fact, that was quite interesting because they discovered that it was really bad to do what they wanted to do, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, the idea that matter versus abstraction is what distinguishes models from reality and puts experiments on the side of reality, models on the side of abstraction. That's not really a good distinction, because you can have theoretical and material models, and you can have theoretical experiments or thought experiments and material experiments, right? So you can have things, let's say an organization of things, serve as the means to represent some structure you don't have access to. You don't need representations to be theoretical representations. What defines it as a representation is actually the arrow of, as you call it, the target. What is encoding and what is decoding, right? In the case of a miniature model, I mean, and a lot of science was done like this for a long time with miniature models of stuff. Even in economics, you have this Irving guy, I forget his first name, from the turn of the 20th century. He built a hydraulic model of the economy, right, with water and stuff, to suggest how quantities of commodities relate. So, for example, you can have, I don't know, like a toy model, a material model of a large dam or a Bay Area, I don't know if it's a dam, like a lake, right? And in this case, you build this by encoding properties that you know about the dam, which is huge, right? And then you decode, you generalize predictions about the dam. You could have here, I mean, if this is a treatable, formalizable system, while the dam is actually an open and complex system or whatever, if it was like a mechanical system, right? A natural mechanical system, you could have formalized it in terms of some numerical structure. You could play it out here, you could simulate it and predict how it will behave in the future. And you would have a theoretical model instead of a material model. So it's actually these arrows here, right, that are the same.
Yeah, but the fact is quite different for me at least, to encode, as you say, some material properties into another material system that is kind of a replica of the first, and see what happens, and to encode it in a numerical system. It's quite different for me. So the fact that both kinds of model exist, they don't answer the big issue that is the foundational issue that I think it's kind of dodged.
Yeah, it's not the topic, man. I'm not trying to solve.
Yeah, it is another topic, but this is my main issue with, you know, the Badiouian concept of model thing.
But he's not trying to explain that.
To go back to it, but I think it's kind of unjust towards his opponents the way he puts it. So, but yeah. There are big foundational issues there. Like,
yeah, I don't see foundational issues. I think a question not answered, but that's different. Like, I don't see how he makes it worse to answer the question. I just don't think he's interested in that. I think the question of, can there be, like, what is a proper understanding of modeling that allows you to use that to, let's say, look into reality of representation in a more immanent way and learn more about it in different
Yeah,
places. That's more
that's
what he's
all.
trying to solve.
Yeah, that's all good. That's all good. That no problem with that. But at the same time, this is used then to base the whole ontology thing. So this is the, you know, blind spot I have with Badiou from the day one. So this is actually a big issue for me. But
Yeah.
this is not.
Honestly,
It has nothing to do with, you know, how to operationalize models. I think they are working, but, you know, philosophical questions, they not necessarily have to do with, you know, making things happen. They also have to do with explaining why they happen the way they happen. So I think there is a blind spot there, philosophically speaking, not necessarily, you know, in the practical sense, but I think there is a blind spot there that is kind of important. So that's
yeah.
just
Well,
my issue.
let me put it like this: the day, I mean, I think we can develop this some other point. Personally, I would say that I haven't seen any productive question appear out of that question. I mean, I don't know what I could do with that question, whereas I know what I could do with this presentation, like with this idea. I don't see any way how this approach cancels out the other philosophical questions. You can still ask them, fine. But I don't see the import of that question to this, though I'm trying to present here something that I think is important in the sense that the moment that the first thing we did is to distinguish modeling from sort of necessary heterogeneity between things. So the only way to model politics, for example, is with a theoretical abstraction about political reality. Well, I think it's safe to say that not even in science, that's how models work. You can have material models, no problem, right? You're actually more concerned with preserving some homogeneity between the systems you're relating than with taking them out of their element and bringing them to some other field. So that's just the first, let's say, correction that is, I think it's useful. The second is that once you do this, it becomes clearer that even in the case of natural laws, this is where I was going with the Robert Rosen quote from another book, is that abstraction is not necessarily a move from reality to something else, but it's an action of abstraction inside reality itself. So isolation and the conditions for you to make sure that the data that you're gathering concerns some phenomenon in a system and doesn't concern interferences from the environment that you can't really pinpoint. That's a sort of abstraction that happens on both sides, right? So anyway, here he's just applying that very similar idea of modelings and things like this to natural laws or natural systems and formal systems. And I think it's a good presentation, and it has a very nice idea of the act of abstraction on the side of encoding phenomena into formal propositions, and the act of de-abstraction, when you decode propositions back into some phenomena, right? Again, I think I just wanted to go into these things because I love it, and I hope we can have time to go into this later on. But it's just to also kind of spell out some of the influences behind the idea that, well, ultimately, political organization can model things about a social reality we don't know. That's pretty much where we're going at, right? And we want to have the most concepts we can, the most useful concepts we can, to make that sort of technical problem of given two forms of organization, why choose one over another? Well, perhaps one of them captures more information about the world you're in than another. That's, in my opinion, an undeveloped region of political discussion, right? And it makes sense to be a serious problem for us under peripheral social conditions where we don't know how to map a totality out of its local parts. So besides, let's say, the logistical problem of how to organize, how to create some basic homogeneity and so on, you have the theoretical problem or the mapping problem of how to do it in such a way that you can actually stitch together information from these different processes and learn something about a space larger than your own, other than through false generalization. This is from Ian Hacking. I just love this quote because his point again is that phenomena are so we usually, when we're too theory driven, we tend to think that phenomena revealed in the laboratory were part of God's handiwork waiting to be discovered. And he says such attitude is natural from a theory dominated philosophy. We formulate theories about the world, we conjecture various laws of nature. Phenomena are supposedly regularities, consequences of the law, right? I suggest in contrast that the Hall effect, because he was discussing this particular electrical effect, does not exist outside of certain kinds of apparatus. And we only think it's out there in pure form because technology was made that actually has the environment for such effects to be produced consistently, right? Does not a current passing through a conductor at right angles to a magnetic field produce a potential anywhere in nature? Yes and no. If anywhere in nature there is such an arrangement with no intervening causes, then the Hall effect occurs. But nowhere outside the laboratory is there such a pure arrangement. To experiment is to create, produce, refine, and stabilize phenomena. If phenomena were plentiful in nature, like summer berries just for the picking, it would be remarkable if experiments didn't work. But phenomena are hard to produce in any stable way. That is why I spoke of creating and not merely discovering phenomena. So for him, I mean, he's clarifying something like the move, right? From an ambience observation to actually the production of something we could call a phenomenon, which is then the thing that is encoded into proposition, which is then the thing that is decoded back into prediction, right? And the thing that he does that is nice and that you can find also in Robert Rosen's work is that the work that goes into the design of an isolated space where phenomena can interact with phenomena, and you can say that something causal is at stake, it's very much akin to the work of coming up with axioms and investigating the consequences of the propositions that are at stake inside that system. So even if you have a natural law here with causation, you still need to, like the act of abstraction that makes it possible is very similar to the act of axiomatic isolation of a set of propositions. So it further reinforces that there is something in common between the process of developing a sort of theoretical framework to explore new propositions and the act of isolating some part of a natural system so that you can actually isolate phenomena. So that's why he says phenomena are not common. Phenomena are not immediate things that are given for you to see. It's very Badiouian, in fact, even though he's like a weird Wittgenstein sort of mix. Because for him, again, phenomena are conditioned on a closed, in a very vague sense, closed operational space. If you cannot define, not create or design a space that is free from certain interactions, and therefore where some operations can appear in pure form, let's say, or more singled out, you cannot even have phenomena, right? So there is a sort of work of abstraction that goes in the formation of an experiment, which is pretty much like the work that goes into the creation of a formal system. So it only further reinforces an idea that I think is very much at stake. For example, in Badiou is very consistent with this proposal, which is the idea that from the perspective of organization, there is no essential distinction between an experiment and a model, or between the modeling relation between a natural system and a formal system and a formal system and another. Right? You can surely say, well, there is no black box when you're looking at entailment on both sides. This is a formal system 1, this is a formal system 2. I can actually derive every step of this, and I can probably derive every step in this inferential law. And therefore, I can understand this much better than if I were to look at a black box on the one of the sides, because this is not a formal system, this is a natural law. I might be able to define some phenomena here, and I might be able to detect some phenomena there, but the law of entailment, the immanent law of entailment here is a black box for me. I cannot see it, right? So it's all ways to try to approach, I think, from a very distinct kind of perspective, but some of the problems that you were talking about, but rather than putting them, Caron, in this sort of big form and then trying to solve it, you kind of empty them out slowly, and you start seeing that there are more similarities at certain levels than we would expect. That already starts to account for why they might articulate with each other, right? If you could find other technical means that are capable of axiomatic isolation, perhaps you could also formalize things without mathematics. I don't know. Anyway, food for thought. So all of this, why say all of this, right? Because it's interesting for us to have that perspective when we talk about producing new models in political life. We're not interested in assuming that there is something like social reality here and that it's all crazy and we're here at a theoretical level. We're just gonna come up with some propositions that explain everything that is going on there, right? The whole position of the book is based on the idea that the best place to learn about capitalism today is starting from what happens to organizations. Because organizations, if you have this crazy social situation here we don't know much about, organizations, they fit some of the criteria of what an experiment is. They can isolate themselves from some interference, right? They can come up with new propositions that they want to experiment with. They can pick up on their own failures and reassess them and say something new about their own test, right? Define like this is a limit point, this is not a good idea, and so on. And so the basic idea is to, let's say, recuperate, or at least perhaps not recuperate, is to come up with a view of political organization where you can bind together concepts, mapping, navigation, experimentation, and this sort of reevaluation of the sort of problems that appear for people organizing. Because the first way that we learn about periphery today is precisely through the left. Like, it's much easier for the right or for a impartial worldview to say everything is the same. It's just a bit shaky today. But if you're trying to do something new, you realize that things go wrong in a new way as well. You realize that you lack things that you had before because you are interested in seeing more, right? You have a commitment to seeing things differently. So it seems to us that the problems of the left today are a good entry point for a new theory of a bigger space than the left. The left is in a privileged position because we are the ones trying to stick to homogeneity. So an impartial sociology today will say something like, well, but people are just in their tribes, you know, everyone, because neoliberalism is all about everyone having their own group. Okay, it could be a preference, it could be ideology. But then when people want to be together, they still can't. And then they realize it's not an ideological problem. It's much more serious than that. It's much more like grounded on the very social terrain than before. One thing is to say people have their own tribes because people like different things. They are looking to represent their personal interests. So some people cheer for this, some people cheer for that. Yeah, but then you come up with a communist collective, you try to organize people, and then you realize that there are no basic social condition for people to be in the same space at the same time. They get either anguished by being placed together, or lack the material means to go to the same place, or lack all sorts of resources to deal with that situation. So suddenly you have a stronger thesis about the world and why it's going the way it's going than if you were just looking from the outside. So that gives a sort of epistemological kind of color to political organization, as if doing political work teaches you how to see more about the world and not simply makes you like fanatic that is engaged and therefore you're not looking at the big picture, right? So it makes that dimension of political life more clear, that this is actually something you need to do and not something that is given simply by looking everywhere, right? So perhaps you could say that there are no social phenomena outside of political life. You have social observations if you look around, but you can't even tell what's important and what is not, what is effective and what is not effective, outside of engaging into something that creates some resistance and makes you capable of assessing, okay, this is serious, this is not, this is relevant, this is not, right? So it's also a good political idea for the time of fake news or whatever you want to call this sort of disenchantment with whatever, like well-established objective agreements. I wouldn't even call it truth, but it makes sense that in a fractured peripheral world, people don't even agree on the form of the earth, right? And the good question, in my opinion, is not how do you convince people to believe the earth is not flat, but what life you need to live so that that information is relevant or not. Like, what would you need to be living like so that knowing that the earth is not flat is actually a useful knowledge, because it might not be, right? And in fact, today, thinking that the earth is not flat became a sort of political thing. Like, people use it to distinguish themselves politically from others, but they don't use it for anything else. Like, I know very few people who have used to the information the world is not flat. In my opinion, we should create the category of there are the flat earthers, there are the sphere earthers, which are people who believe the earth is not flat, but it's just out of a blind belief, because it's also not doing anything for them. They don't know how to work with that information. They don't know what to do with it. They just know how to feel superior to others by saying it. But that's all it does. So we believe that the proposal we are presenting here is very much not only in tune with those general things I mentioned about peripherization, but they also are at least aware that if you want to talk about producing new knowledge, new representation, a new model for action, evaluation of actions, for developing a view, strategic view for politics, you should take a position that is more immanent to a political process than something that is from the outside. Because as I suggested, for Frederick Jameson, the period where we could trust one formal view from the outside that touches on the totality by extrapolating from the local, it was a sort of monopoly capitalist period, where if I know the tendencies, if I know the basic form of surplus extraction, I know how things will happen everywhere. But we cannot say that anymore, right? So we need to find a new way to connect local activity with some knowledge about totality. So that brings us into the relation of creating experiments, generalization, theorization, and all of that. So that's why that crazy part is included here. It has some meaning. It's not just a general thing. So we begin like constructing the idea from 5 premises. The first of them, which I think should be a bit clearer with this introduction, is that we begin with the idea that we should not suppose that there is some common ground to the different traditions of the left. That if I think that the form of the argument is the following. If today we have social formations which are not homogeneous, right? If social formations are not homogeneous, then homogeneity is not necessary or not original, not structural necessity. If that is the case, then the fact that there were multiple approaches to social formation, and I think that we developed this following Karatani as saying that a sort of nation-based or community-based approach to social formation, a state-based approach to social formation, and an economic or capitalist-based approach to social formation. This is not by chance. This is because if today we're seeing these things struggling to be connected, they were struggling to be connected in the beginning already of modernity. So there are multiple lefts because all social formations were multiple to start with. So our initial thesis is this: let's start from this multiplicity and not suppose homogeneity between the approaches in the left. The second thesis is, well, if we suppose that there's something like a multiple structure, right, going on in the background, that there's not one organizational theoretical tradition in the left, then even if there is one discourse, right, some proposition here, it might mean different things for different places, or might different things for different organizations or for different traditions, right? We cannot assume that just because I know what people are saying, that I know the meaning or the place that that saying has on a certain political fragment or social fragment. So I cannot analyze political life from the standpoint of discursivity anymore. So it's a sort of critique of discursive analysis. Our perspective is that you need to know the domain to which language refers. You need to have some concrete domain of reference, because you cannot assume that there is a homogeneous domain of reference that everyone is included. And people who say something politically here, that says something about them that is the same that if somebody else said it somewhere else. So it's kind of on the one hand, it diminishes our capacity to know social reality, but on the other hand, it's also saying, yeah, you should pay attention to something else, right? Which we call the sort of practical approach. So rather than trust what the left says about what it's doing, you should look at what it's doing while it's saying what it's doing, what it should be doing, or whatever. So how do we do things in different places? That will define a sort of domain of use for these propositions, rather than just looking at propositions and assuming you know what they mean, right? I think that a very good example of this is the use of conservative slogans in politics. You can see, I don't know, conservative customs being kind of described by the Gilets jaunes in France, but that doesn't really help you to, if these people are saying something that is not politically correct here, and those people following Trump are saying the same thing, therefore they are the same. You're totally missing the domain of reference which you should take into consideration before making any such judgment, right? So that's let's say the second condition we're trying to take into consideration. The third condition is that you shouldn't look at organizations as being self-contained. So it's not only enough to move from, let's say, the discursive realm to a sort of, let's call it organizational realm to analyze, because this space here, even though it might have very specific rules that are very distinct from this other organizational space, the way that it understands this might actually justify the way that it behaves rather than looking inside. So you can't really understand organizations as pure self-contained things, because part of what they're doing is responding to other organizations, right? So there's a large number of political groups that only exist in Brazil because the Workers' Party failed. Like very consistency derives from the failure of another organization. So if you look inside to their own practice, it seems like it lacks consistency. It lacks self-sustainability as a sort of space. But once you realize that part of its consistency is derived from something else, so therefore there is a connection between these organizations, it makes more sense. So it's not enough simply to move to a more concrete domain of reference, but you also need to consider how these different domains interact. The third principle is that, well, even though we're talking about a fracture space and we're talking about many domains like this is not a good image, because it's obvious that if you look at political organizations in the world, generally they are a mixture in two senses, right? So if we stick to this idea that there are a communitarian left, an institutional left, and an economic left, an organization is generally a mixture of these things in different ways. So that, for example, at a certain level of analysis, it's very much institutional. It's a party participating in elections. But at a higher, like a level of discourse, it organizes its discourse in an anti-capitalist way. But at the level of how it self-sustains itself, it's a voluntary, personal favor, communitarian system. And it's all these things at the same time. But other arrangements are possible as well. So we want to assume that it's not like there are some basic traditions and then everything fits into one. Things tend to be mixtures of all of this. And these mixtures tend to happen at different levels of analysis at the same time. So it's not enough to define a domain of reference like this, right? There is like discursivity here, and you define organization like this. Because organization is in fact something like this, with things interacting in multiple levels, right? So it's not enough just to move like this as if you found some common solid ground. And the fifth condition is to say, well, all of this needs to be constructed with tools that are already part of the leftist arsenal. So what our ultimate idea, so the ultimate principle is the following. Let's say you have the social space. There is some organization here. Generally, we have a lot of tools to analyze the world outside of us. We can describe capitalism in terms of law of value, exploitation, surplus extraction, whatever. We can discuss institutions, democracy, sovereignty, self-determination, and so on. We can discuss communities, oppression, segregation, and so on. Our point is, well, first of all, we don't know how to analyze the world right now. It's very confusing, but we can use these tools to analyze what happens inside of our organization. So the tools that were supposedly perfect for looking at the world as a homogeneous thing, they can help us to see inside the black box of organizations. And if organizations have the capacity to gather information about the world, because they are in the world, made of people who are also in the world, with resources which are also in the world, with technology and techniques that are also in the world, you can use these theoretical resources to understand what's going on inside. And you can then use this to say new things about the outside. So you invert the order, right? So scientific socialism is like this. Here is Soviet, right? We look at the outside and we say, look at capitalism. It is like this and like that. Therefore, we are not like this, right? So we define ourselves in seconds. Our perspective is something slightly different, right? Here is something we're doing. Let's look at what happened inside. If this is what happened inside, probably we can evaluate if it has nothing, if it doesn't have some consequence on the outside as well. So you extract knowledge from what happens inside rather than have knowledge about the outside and then you define yourself with relations with, right? Anyway, so this is the last sort of basic principle, and then we give it some meat. So I just present the 5 principles because I think it's possible to come up with a different kind of version of this that preserves this principles but uses other specific ideas. So we distinguish the 2 parts, right? So the first thing we do is to define, okay, how could we define different sources or traditions for the left? And I actually think that there is a nice kind of precedent to this. You know that there's this famous text called The 3 Sources of Marxism, right? I think that's how it's called. It's a Lenin text, if I'm not mistaken, where Lenin talks about French politics, English political economy, and German philosophy. He says these are the sources of Marx, right? Marx thinking is based on German philosophy. Well, but if you look carefully, German philosophy was very much a national problem, like Fichte and so on, national identity and the creation of Prussia and so on, right? British political economy, clearly a problem of industrial revolution, the development of market capitalism and so on, and French politics, which was very much the place where political state revolutions were going on. So the very way that Lenin phrases this, the 3 sources of Marx, if you just stop pretending like those 3 sources have anything to do with each other necessarily, like just look at them for what they are, you actually get the logic of nations on the level of what German philosophy was doing, like Hegel, recognition, and all those problems, right? You get the logic of institutions with Rousseau, self-determination, French Revolution, kill the king, or whatever, right? And you get the development of political economy with Adam Smith, Ricardo, and so on. So it's not such a crazy idea. And we actually have a lot of precedents for this. Not only Karatani, who we obviously stole this from, but Karl Polanyi as well. Karl Polanyi is a guy who proposed that there are 3 modes of exchange, right? Reciprocity, plundering, and commodity exchange. He already proposed this idea before Karatani. Karatani also proposes it, but I think that there is this nice intuition in Lenin when he says German idealism, French politics, and English political economy. I think that his idea was Marx is kind of combining things that are similar or that are connected. But perhaps another way of understanding is to say that these are actually pointing a different direction. And the genius is also finding a way to combine these things, right? So, I mean, we discussed this in other meetings like the one I did on Karatani, but to go very quickly over this, we define very much like Karatani, but with an addition, the logic of community or communitarian logic as being based on reciprocal exchanges, or being mostly the space of familial and kinship relations, or usually being commonality implying some shared narrative or some common mythology. Its modern form would be the nation. But then we add 2 things that are not in Karatani. One is the idea of an immanent paradox, which is the idea of sacrifice, in the sense that if you take reciprocity far enough beyond balanced reciprocity into negative reciprocity, destroying things might be a form of giving things, right? So sacrifice is a sort of internal, not a negation, right? But a sort of internal inconsistency or an internal dimension of gift giving itself, right? But we also define something we call unstable form, which is not really the, let's say, action or a symptomatic point, but a way that something can consist while looking at its inverse, right? So you can have not only a community that is inwardly structured by positive reciprocity, but you can also have communities that are structured by negative reciprocity with the other. So you can extract cohesion both out of positive and negative communities. You don't need to always bet on the positive version. This is useful. You will see that these two things are useful later on for us. So the logic of institutions, again, is very much similar to Karatani. It's based on contractual exchanges, the space of relations of plunder and redistribution. It's based on the idea of a forced social pact, right? Like in Hobbes and so on. The modern form is the state, and we think that what sacrifice is for reciprocity, sovereignty is for institutions, in the sense that it is kind of a paradoxical inside and outside position, right? The sovereign is both making the law count, but if he makes the law count, he's not under the law, right? In the same way that sacrifice is making gift possible, but at the same time that it's destroying something, it's actually guaranteeing that it continues, right? And for us, in the same way that war is a sort of negative version of nation, but it's equally consistent, we treat revolution as a sort of inverse of the state. You can call it as a sort of moment of instability, but it can actually be the very form of cohesion of the state. So for example, the idea of a permanent revolution in Soviet state, or making it seem like you're constantly changing, can very well be the way that bureaucracy works for the state. It doesn't need to be the break and end all of bureaucracy or of state power. Finally, with the logic of value, you have commodity exchanges. You have the space of non-equivalent commodity exchanges through markets, merchant capital, interest capital, industrial capital. Rather than sharing or forcing, you have impersonal value exchanges, defining the space of value. The modern form of commodity exchange is given by capital, but you also have paradoxes inside, like the law of accumulation, where the more labor produces value, the more you can remove labor from the equation, right? It's the weird part of the law of capitalist accumulation in volume 1 of Capital, where the more labor aggregates value to products, the more pauperized, the more valueless labor becomes, right? So how can it be that it's both inside the process of valorization and kind of outside, right? Another way of thinking about this that is similar to sovereignty, but very specific to value, is that labor power exists in capitalism, but labor has no value, but labor power has value. So it's both inside and outside of value in a weird way, right? And again, crises seem to be for capital what revolutions are for state and wars are for nation. The sort of thing that looks like the exception, looks like the break, but it's actually the thing that makes it continue, right? So not satisfied with defining these three logics, the moment that we define this sort of immanent negations, right, this sort of unstable forms, we created a very weird and huge kind of system where you can actually come up with a lot of different social formations. Like it's a much bigger framework than Marx's, which is like 4 social formations, right? You can have a social formation where community is dominant, institutional logic or the state logic is subdominant, and the economic logic is like the third version or the third logic inside, right? But you can have one where community is dominant, economic logic or value logic is the second one, the subdominant one, and the institutional one is the third one, right? But you cannot, what we added that is not in Karatani is that, for example, you can have a situation where crisis, so the negation, the unstable form of the economic logic is the dominant one. Strong institutions, positive institutions or states are the subdominant, and positive or stable communities are the third. Or you can have what I think is our current case where is it here? Like everything is negated, right? Something like some of these here, where crisis capitalism benefits from a sort of permanent state revolution where nobody really belongs to their position. Everyone is kind of accusing others of not really living up to their social pact. And this allows you to create a sort of constant perpetual war with the population itself. So this is a valid social formation. And you can still distinguish between state and communal crises inside of this. So for example, you can have segregational crisis being more important than state crisis in social formation, and that distinguishes it. So we just highlighted here the ones that have the economy as or the capitalist, the law of value in the center point, right? Because these would be the many different social formations that we could distinguish in capitalism. So it seems like it's useful for a larger analysis of contemporary social formations. And with the addition, and I think that this is why the peripherization thesis is coming into play. If you look at these two, it's only positive economy, positive institution, positive community, right? So it has the idea that these things positively reinforce each other. Well, the peripherization thesis suggests that fragments don't really go well together, right? So we should start exploring this space here, where at least one logic is unstable. At least one logic doesn't cover things properly or appears as its inverse, right? Things like this. So it's a big kind of addition to how we could analyze peripheral social formations without, and it just shows that there is a lot to see. It's not like there is one formula for it. There are many possibilities. We don't know which one or how and so on, right? This is just a very kind of, just a demonstration that there is a lot to unpack today. So with that idea, right, and as I said, the basic premise we're dealing with is that rather than looking out and asking, oh, which one of these things here is happening in the world, as if we could know, our thesis is we can use these things to analyze insight and look what happens within organizations and within the left, and then derive new knowledge about what's going on. So our interest in this is to use theoretical models of the left to target the left itself, to say these things are actually good material for learning about the left and how the left organizes, more perhaps than learning about the world. The world right now is a very big black box. We can't really see inside very well. It's way too complex, hard to map, structure, and so on. But the left can be a small material model that we can have more access to what's going on than looking outside. So that's why we come up with a sort of inward-looking version of these three logics, and we call the communitarian left, the institutional left, and the economic left, right? So CIE, as I was using before, and we give one basic addition in order to make this shift, right? Our main thesis is that we can thus qualify as left an organization that relates negatively to at least one of the three social logics we listed. So there are many ways one can be in the left, right? And the basic operation we are adding to simply move from global analysis of the world to an analysis of the left, we're saying the only distinction between the left and all other organizations is that in some way, something in these organizations are committed to the negation of at least one of these three logics, right? And it's crucial to emphasize that not only does this summary description leave out important aspects, of course, these logics are not so simple as this, but also that there is no left-wing organization that defends a pure version of any of these three forms, right? Nor that denies them abstractly without social mixture. So in reality, what we should expect to see are mixes of these three things in different scales, in different ways to organize different dimensions of an organization, but generally you get a mixture. You don't get like a pure form, because after all, social formations are themselves not just one of these things. So our definition then needs to use this negation to define the left, and we define the communitarian left as a sort of negation at the level of nations, communities. It's trying to propose a different community. So for example, it tends to focus on forms of suffering or forms of wrongness that are connected to community life. So oppression, which implies dominance of one community over another, segregation, which implies separation of communities. It tends to trust reciprocity as a solution against sovereignty and against capital accumulation. So for example, we will show that some societies where reciprocity was an important principle of cohesion, it was impossible to accumulate so much wealth. You will, for example, philosophically try to show that you can have communities that are not identitarian. So of course, you will never find this in pure form, perhaps only in philosophy and political philosophy you will. But generally, you can associate with what we're calling communitarian left, a negation that is focused on the community. It's focusing on working on intervening at that level. So it defines nation as a big problem, or at least as the realm where it intervenes. Oppression and segregation tend to be central themes and so on. So the institutional left would be focused on negation at the level of the state. And this means that it's not really oppression and segregation, which are more natural ways of expressing wrongness at the level of institution, but expropriation, which means deviation of property, right? And I think that it's important to distinguish expropriation and exploitation. You can have exploitation without expropriation, right? Exploitation, in fact, in economic exploitation, it would be so easy if it was simply expropriation. Like, I produced something which is mine, and then the capitalist takes it from me. But when you start using cooperation of workers to produce something that the corporation produced, but no worker could ever produce, how can you pinpoint it back to the producer as the property owner? You can't. So it's very important to separate exploitation from expropriation. Expropriation has a very strong contractual property rights part to it, right? And the rupture of social pacts as well. So people who should represent us don't represent us. Proposals that were suggested and were not followed through. People who had specific functions that they didn't follow through, right? And just as reciprocity is supposedly a remedy against sovereignty and accumulation, participation in political life, so sort of institutional participation, is supposed to be a remedy against sacrifice and accumulation, against the inconsistencies of reciprocity and the inconsistencies of commodity exchange. And just as there is a lot of work in, for example, political thinking to suggest that community is not the same as identity, you can have communities that break away with everything that makes a community become a nation. You have the idea that you can distinguish the common good or the public good from bureaucracy. That there is something like the public good or the republic or some level of commonwealth. I think I should actually have written here the commonwealth. That is not the government, it's not the state property. And it's very important to suggest that this exists if you want to negate the state, but also remain at the level of institution, right? So you can come up with institutional arrangements where we're managing the common good, but we're not turning it into state property or something like that. And finally, you have the sort of economic left, which is focused on the negation of capital. It focuses on exploitation and pauperization, which are not reducible to any of these terms. So it has to do with the emptying out of conditions of work, and it has to do with the removal of value or the distribution and production of value and the accumulation of value, and we even say wealth. It tends to trust that new forms of production will solve the problem of sacrifice and the problem of sovereignty. So for example, if there are no bosses, people will already vote differently because they don't need to uphold the interests of their employers in order to live. So they don't need to have fear of if my employer doesn't get benefits, economic benefits, I will be unemployed. So the very restructuring of production tends to be seen as a way out of economy of sacrifice and economy of and an institutional logic of sovereignty, right? And many people try to suggest that concrete labor can be totally separated from abstract labor, right? So the same way that something like the common good can be separated from the public, I think that would be a better way of putting it here. And community separated from identity. There is an idea that there is some form of laboring that is non-capitalist, that can be organized in a new way, that can lead to different sort of society and so on, right? So in every case, you see that you focus on one of the logics, and there is a sort of view that is both strategic in a very vague sense, but also chooses what is relevant, chooses what is to be the focus of your struggle, that depends on the logic that you're kind of struggling with. But as we said, we're not supposing that everyone is on one of these, right? We're supposing that these things actually get mixed together. So this is also so you can imagine, let's say, just looking at this, the right side here first, you can imagine that there is actually a social formation that mixes community, economic, and institutional logics, right? And you can negate, for example, just one of them and focus on this as a solution to all of this, right? Or you can, for example, focus on this as a solution to all of this. But of course, that's not a necessity. You don't need to be so clear cut. You can, of course, kind of go into these three directions at the same time, but be more effective in one or another. And this depends both on the social formation, on what's going on, what's relevant, right? And on the way that the organization itself is constructed. So we came up with a different way of defining what it means to be on the left. The first idea is not really on the left, it's on the outer margin of being a leftist organization, which is when you don't really want to negate anything, but you just want to change the order of dominance. So for example, you live in a society where the economic logic, like it's a capitalist society, but institutions have a larger role to play than communities. And you just want to change it so that capitalist economy is still in place, but you can organize in anarchist community-like ways, and institutions are not so important. This is like an end cap structure. It's not negating anything in the world. It's just proposing to change the order here. I don't want the state to rule my life. I want to be able to organize the way I want in my own communal ways. But the structure of these logics remain in place. So we could say that it's a confusion between negation and this just inversion, right? You're just trying to propose a different domination rather than negating one of these logics, right? There is a second way that you can define left, which is now, let's say, already inside the field of the left in some sense, but which is when you confuse negation with the unstable form. So rather than move from, let's say here, community, I'll use just the nation, state, and capital. So rather than move from nation to the negation of it, you move from nation to war. It's still inside the logic of nationalities and communities. It's inverse form, or it's a sort of, let's make it all unstable, or at least this will shake things up, right? Similar, you can propose a change from state to revolution, but that doesn't necessarily, okay, revolution, what doesn't mean that it's more than just an abstract negation, right? Or to say that to be in a state of crisis in capitalism is for some reason better. It's true that this is a transformation, but it's not really negation. It's actually just you're betting on the unstable form, right? So you're not really solving the problem of new community relations. you're just substituting positive community for negative community, like guerrilla communism. In some sense, it's not really solving any community problems. It's just substituting positive communities based on identities for negative communities that is at war with someone else. That gives you a lot of consistency, but that doesn't really mean it's an internal consistency, right? So that would be a second way of thinking about this. A third way is when, as something I was suggesting until now, you choose one logic to negate, but you uphold the other two. So you pretty much keep these things the way they are, but here you propose something that is different. So let's change exploitative relations. Let's propose a cooperative, but we still segregate racially and by gender, and we still keep institutional relations pretty much the same, right? So you're negating only one case. But you can also have situations where you negate both cases. For example, this is very common in socialism, what was called state socialism, which was the idea I can negate national interest and negate capitalist interest by affirming state interest. So I move here to try to separate these two things, right? You can even define nationalism, liberalism, fascism, liberalism, and socialism in this way. If you bet on state to break between these two, that's called socialism, right? You reinforce state against capital and against nation. If now I bet on national communitarian interests to break the relation between state and capital, I'm actually a fascist, right? I'm reinforcing national ties, segregation, and so on, so that I can break with a sort of like burn value. That's exactly what they did, right? And at the same time, kind of undo the relation between state and capital. For example, by going after bankers and so on, right? Or I can be a liberal that reinforces capitalism against the relation between national and state interests, right? So you can actually have a sort of, I think that in this case it's not really perfect because fascism and liberalism, they're actually trying to uncouple things, but they don't really try to change the stuff that they're uncoupling. They're just reinforcing one of them. So you could say this is, let's say, very strong for liberalism. This is very strong for fascism. But state socialism is the one that actually tried to do like this, right? By reinforcing this. So I wouldn't put everything in the same category. Only this one is actually properly leftist, right? But still, you can divide between negating one logic, negating two logics, and then the big problem, which is how do you negate the three logics at once? What is something that negates here, here, and here simultaneously? And if you negate everything simultaneously, on what are you supporting yourself, right? One thing that people who already know Karatani a bit might realize that we didn't add a fourth logic, like a fourth ring called MOD, right? Or free association, because it seems to us that this might be supposing a bit too much. It's an issue to be discussed if this thing is not constructed by negating the other three. So as long as you come up with a community that is not identity, a commonwealth that is not public good, a form of organization that is not abstract labor or productivity based, you might be constructing this other thing rather than supposing that it is already there. So we prefer to leave it kind of slightly different than Karatani on this point. All of this to give kind of a bit of meat to this idea that there are different sources for the left. And it seems very consistent to apply these different sources to different attractors of the left, right? But then we are not saying that you're going to find like a magazine test. Which left are you? Are you a communitarian left, institutional left? Not like that. Of course, that everything's a bit mixed. So you can have anti-capitalist organizations who focus on the economy at the level of discourse, but are organized in social reproduction terms like community, but also only are able to intervene on the world institutionally. That would be like a leftist party in Brazil, right? So we thought of dividing 4 basic questions for assessing these slices, right? Assessing these different logics in an organization, which is the epistemological one. Okay, how are we supposed to know things? How does this process, this organization, think we know about reality? Do we know about reality by personal relations, by direct oppression, by the experience of segregation? Do we know about reality, about social reality and capitalism or whatever, through the indignation at the ruptures of social pacts, corrupt politicians and that sort of thing, or the will to participate into some discussion and not being able to, or the passing of laws? How is it that we come to know? What are the relevant inputs, right, that social reality gives to an organization? So the answer might come from any of these, or from a mixture of them. How does a given organization act? So what are the layer or the form of intervention what are the differences that are relevant at the moment of intervening? So some movements, for example, manage to very well, for example, imagine the Black Panthers, they manage to mix very nicely community and economic relations by, on one hand, being very clear about the race aspect of their political organization and the role of organizing the Black community, but at the same time, that organization had effects on formation for the job market, creation of communitarian economic units and things like this. So doesn't mean that just because you focus epistemologically on, for example, communitarian aspects, you're segregated, you're oppressed. It doesn't mean you will act directly on segregation and oppression. You might very well act at a level of economic change or passing new laws, right? So you are, on the one hand, you are being directly affected by personal or direct violence, but you act on impersonal bureaucratic level. That happens, right? Then we ask, okay, but how does it see itself? How does it represent itself? Because it might be accepting inputs from one way, acting on another, but also representing itself, seeing itself in a different way. So it might be like a political party that only knows what is relevant by looking at the votes. It only intervenes through specific kind of personal favors and personal status and honor and charisma of a person, but it thinks of itself as doing big anti-systemic economic changes and being an actor in that way. And it could be the case that if it didn't see itself in that way, it actually saw itself as, we're here to make small changes. It actually might be more appealing even if we just drop that. So, and finally, the fourth level is, how does it actually maintain itself as a sort of organism in the world, right? How does it manage to stay alive? Because it's not only the political intervention or the knowledge of the world or the way you represent yourself. You need to be doing something even when you're not doing anything, in terms of how people are brought into organization, how work is distributed. So for example, a classic situation in leftist organization, they are radically anti-capitalist, they're working on trade unions and other economic things. They see themselves as emancipating humanity because the economics dimension is the essential one, but they're pretty much racist and misogynist here, right? So you can still keep segregative relations at the level of social reproduction, keep women on the kitchen of the trade union meetings and things like this, right? So this is a way of refracting all this logic inside a mixed logic space. It's a way of slicing that might make make these logics appear more clearly, right? So this leads us, I'm just going to go very quickly over this. When you have these logics in play, you can start talking about two things which are concerned at ecological point of view we were talking about. Because, for example, the fact that in this organization one here, the economic dimension is very pronounced. They're talking about anti-systemic change. They're like Maoists in Rio de Janeiro, right? They're so crafty at it that another organization diminishes the importance of this simply because it's affected by the other one. Like, it's not even like they don't even test if you can interact at that level. You just don't want to do what the other is doing, right? So your belief on the fact that this is not important comes from the failure of the other organization into showing that it is important. So for example, you can have a lot of organizations that bet on communal or, for example, institutional perspectives because they look at something else and they say, look at that other thing. They believed something else was possible and they clearly failed. So I won't do the same mistake again. So the inner consistency of this, to understand this, you need to actually look at this. You cannot look at this by itself. Otherwise, you won't understand how it can keep on putting this down as a relevant factor, right? So actually, this thing I just said is actually this second case, right? The effects of the dominance of economic logic on organization 2 justifies its subordination in logic 1, right? So this is not important because it is important for somebody I don't agree with, right? In the first case, actually, was a different example, is that the form of organization of one is determined by the belief in economy that I'm supposing in the other. So it's not that the other actually does this. I just suppose that that's what it's doing. So for example, I think others are Stalinists. Because they're Stalinists, then I'm doing something else in my organization because I don't want to be like them. So I cannot understand, and this I think is actually a very concrete thing. I don't think you can understand how assemblies work in political organizations in Brazil if you don't know that people are trying not to be like organizations that they suppose are authoritarian. Like, it's not that you tried it out and this is what works best for that organization. It's simply that you assume that something else is being done somewhere else and you need to avoid it, right? Anyway, once you have all these different organizations emphasizing different logics and putting other logics in subordination for different reasons, you can imagine a sort of ecosystem forming where even though they're all heterogeneous and they're all mixed, there is a tendency for example, joining those that tend to privilege more community over other parts of their own structure, and others that privilege economic structure over other aspects, which they're also part of. So there is a bit of everything in all of them, but there's more of E in this ones, more of I in this ones, and more of C. So you can kind of get a theory of a tendency of separation in the political sphere without supposing that they're just that, right? And this is interesting because, for example, we might have interesting economic experiments here that even though these guys seem like they have nothing to do with these guys, once you have this experiment here, it might actually say something about something which is kind of invisible in the other organization. We had this experience a lot in the circle because we have organizations that come from very different structures, and we're talking about what happens. So at some point, we come up with some proposition about something that is relevant for communitarian organization. And then you realize that some other structure that doesn't think itself in those terms, doesn't map the reality in that way, you actually find the same problem there. It's just not how they tend to think about themselves, right? So you can actually come up with ways of combining or making transit between these organizations a bit better. If you can find ways of binding them together that are kind of counterintuitive, based on the things you learn from their experience as well. So this leads us to, I mean, I'm almost done, guys, don't worry. This leads us to the fourth principle. We were talking about mixtures and scales and so on. And one way we found to bring this in, and it has a lot to do with what you said, Raquel, about transference and this sort of spaces where people don't count as one, right? They might count always in relation with somebody else, or they might count in more than just two. So we found a way of defining the sort of metric units of different logics. I don't think it's a perfect system, but I think it's good enough to start. And the idea is that we can distinguish the metric, so the basic unit, in a numerical way of how you distinguish communitarian, institutional, and economic or value logic. And the idea is that the basic number you need to come up with a relation, right? A sort of reciprocal relation is actually its basic unit is a dual relation. So the idea is that the relation actually defines the terms here, right? So it's actually a relation between two actually forms the two poles. But if you have a space with like a bunch of stuff, ultimately the basic unit you need to start mapping or covering this space by paying attention to the reciprocal dimension is by looking at it like this, taking things 2 by 2. Ultimately, you will cover everything, right? Everything is covered here. And you can actually get to the point where everything is connected. And you can actually define, for example, let's put it like this. Let's say that these two are connected, these two are connected, and these two are connected. So everyone is connected to everyone. But then only this guy is connected to this, and then this guy is connected to this, and this is connected to this, right? Well, this is a very dense area, right? This, for example, can be a family. A family is a situation where everyone is related to everyone, where this might be a friend, where it's only related to one. So you can actually build up very complex textures of relations by starting with coverings of numericity too, right? Institutions can't really be, you can't really ever arrive at an institutional view if you start from counting from the perspective of two. Because if you have a space that, if you always cover things like this, they're always reciprocal. So you get to a whole perspectivist problem of what is a dominating term and how does things look from each term. It's a whole other matter. But our suggestion is that you can actually define institutional logic if you imagine that the relation between two is always mediated by a third. So there's only a relation between two if the two relate to a third. This guy only marries this person if this third person guarantees it. This guy only buys something that this guy is selling or just fixes a contract with them if there is a document that mediates their relation. So you can never really look at things 2 by 2 to cover a world institutionally. You basically need to cover it 3 by 3, right? In this sort of way. And of course, you can imagine that, for example, if one same institution is always a third, it's a very strong institution. But there might be agreements that are pacts that only these two people are making, like they're not really connecting with the rest of society. But you see, like, we're not defining scale, and this is something I think is very important to explore. Stop defining scale in terms of quantity or zooming or looking at size. You can define scale much more profoundly by resolution and by the sort of metric of coverings of a space, right? And how these coverings give you a different picture, right? So our idea is that you can look at it dually in a Trinitarian way, but you can also look at it in a sort of quaternary logic, which is how commodity relations need to work. This guy only exchanges with this guy if there is something that exchanges with something else, like this. Even if this guy is his own labor power. So this is why there is no relation between property owners, only between the commodities themselves, right? And if you want to go further, and we try to do this in the Karatani group, we can go totally crazy and actually show in a sort of crazy geometrical structure that if you combine this, right, where the third connects these two things, with this quaternary exchange relation into this, you actually get money. Money as the thing that mediates the relation between commodities, as if it was a sovereign. So you can actually do a lot of nice, crazy geometrical play with, you know, this way these things might get stitched together in crazy ways. But this is useful for us because it allows us to look at an organization. Again, we don't think we are in a condition to make a theory of this for everything, but it's an important tool because if you have an organization with a bunch of members, you might be able, for example, to evaluate reciprocal relations. You might be able to evaluate, let's say, some principles here, some institutional relation that these people are having with each other, right? You might be able to evaluate the fact that this person here and this person here exchange in some way, but they never, this doesn't mean that they have some relations between them, right? This is very useful because monetary relations in organization are quaternary. So they don't relate people, right? So you can have a whole analysis of professional militants in organizations and how money plays into the consistency of organization from this perspective, right? So again, these are tools that are made to analyze the whole world, but we think that the only way to actually open the black box of peripheral social formations is turning them inward. It's doing the classic Edward Norton in Fight Club and punching yourself in the face before. That's how you get the upper hands, right? So this is just an image of what happens when you don't take layers and resolutions into consideration. You might get a structure that's very complex. See, for example, these two people here are related personally, but they're also, these two people are related through some contract, but these people exchange money, for example, so some of their relation is beyond the professional or whatever. But this all gets flattened out into this sort of Latourian actor network structure where you don't see all of that. You see everything, and that's actually the problem. You see too much at the same time. And you don't know how to intervene, or you don't understand why this is more important than this and things like this, right? So our idea is to try to navigate this rather than so quickly flatten it to this picture. And again, this allows us to bring the communitarian, institutional, and economic logics into play, and look at what is having the power of effectivity in a given organization. It might be the case that this level, this layer here, is the one where the most freedom is being produced, and at the level of bureaucratic, the organization is very strict and authoritarian. But look at this. This might be interesting. So don't judge it so quickly. Or on the contrary, it's very humble in terms of its economic change capacity. It's very weak in terms of negating economic reality. But look at the communitarian stuff. It's actually changing a lot and creating relations beyond identity and so on. So it's a way to kind of make our analysis of the morphology of organizations much more subtle. And again, if the social conditions are such that the systems themselves are hybrid in singular ways, they're not always the same, you need to have a way to look at an organization that is totally different from what you believe in, evaluate its place in a certain social space, and see if it's not a good thing that it is effective in that way there. Right? Rather than suggesting everyone should organize in some particular way. But we also don't want to simply say everyone do their own thing, because we don't trust that social resistance will accumulate by itself into something greater. So you need at the same time to accept fragmentation and to develop tools to bring those fragments into relation somehow. So that's kind of what we're building, right?
So in a sense, as you said in the text, it's interesting that this is a model for a descriptive approach, but it also has to have kind of a prescriptive consequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a sense. So once you get a point of view that acknowledges these multi-leveled structures, you get kind of more different criteria in order to organize as well. So this might give us different prescriptions also to further organizing.
Exactly.
In a sense.
Exactly. I think that one thing that makes that a bit clearer is that, for example, if we assume that there is, let's say, communitarian, institutional, and economic lefts, you could say that they're all betting on different paths, right? But we are saying that even if one of these dominates on a given organization, all organizations have a communitarian and institutional dimension, economic and a communitarian and an institutional and economic, which means that, let's say these guys here create something interesting, right? This let's say increase in visibility of some issue, it can help these guys here, even though they didn't really worry about this before. So people who are focusing on another problem might produce something which is not, let's say, your way of approaching it, but it might actually influence how you do stuff, right? So you can also imagine that this moves forward somehow and influences how these things do things, and these guys move forward and influence how these do things, right? So it's descriptive. The model is descriptive because we're using leftist theories to describe what we do. So here's an organization, and rather than using its theory to look outward, we're putting the theory in doing this. But it's also prescriptive because once you start moving around in your organization, you might actually come up with stuff that models what happens in a different organization better than what they did. So you see why the whole shenanigans with models, experiments, and expansion and blah, blah, it actually makes some sense. Because ultimately, you need both things. You need to be able to move from organization to a sort of representation and use it to see yourself. But you can also move to a new organization, which might actually itself be a model for something else. It might actually say reinterpret a theory, a representative mapping, or it might return to another organization. So this is I would call this the Bogdanovian hypothesis, which is from the organizational point of view, theories and organization or theories and collectives are instantiated by different materials, which make them singular and distinct. But at some level, there is a transition you can make because what counts is the organizational stuff. So you can imagine
at the same time, it seems you are distinguishing between different types of organizations. So this is quite important as well.
Yes.
Otherwise, if you just stop at organization as
everything is the same,
is homogeneous, you end up in the Latourian picture.
Yeah.
You see? You end up like everything is an organization, so everything is kind of qua organization. They are the same, but you're not doing that. You are actually navigating the mediations. So this is scale is mediation there as well, like different kinds of mediations, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's exactly right. And not only that, but the idea is you see the resistance or the other to organization is organization as well. So how do you define social formation? By nation, state, capital, and the many ways these things relate. How do you define a leftist organization? By community, institution, and economic which is a transformation of this based on negation. So they're essentially compatible, even though they're totally heterogeneous. So you recuperate that idea of formal homogeneity, even if they're distinct. So there's a dialectics now between the analysis of economic life, analysis of nation-state capital, and the analysis of what happens in organizations, because this description of social formations is compatible with this description. So it's not out of the picture that this could give you a new picture of this.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why all of this is. So ultimately, the idea is you bring this modeling perspective just so the heterogeneity you get at the level of communities, institutions, and economic logics for a leftist organization can be seen as a small miniature, right? It's potentially a miniature for this larger social system, social formation, which has nation, state, and capital all mixed together, right? So we are allowed to look inside to learn about the outside. And once you're allowed to do this, you are allowed to call this an experiment in a very vague sense that needs to be further discerned, of course, but we get closer to that, right? And at the same time, so it seems beneficial, like it seems like it moves in the right direction. So the last thing we propose because you see, like each one of these things, they are just recuperating one of those principles, right? So the primacy of the multiple, we have here the three sources of the left. The practical perspective becomes these four perspectives, four ways of slicing or questioning an organization, right? And the ecology becomes the role of conflict and alliance in the consistency of organizations. The mixture and scalability becomes the composition of multiple approaches, right? And finally, what we called theoretical homogeneity, right? That idea of using theory to look at organizations themselves becomes this thing here, which is our own quick take on Jameson's cognitive mapping, but with a slight difference. We propose to imagine a sort of thermometer, right, or a certain kind of a scale that can tend to both sides, right? It can come more on this side, which means that theories and organizations displace your experience towards the social structure. So you can use conceptual constructions to move away from experience towards structure. But you can use the same concept to reduce structure to the size of your experience. So for example, you can use the notion of surplus value to learn to see the world from a different perspective than your experience. Nobody experiences surplus value. Surplus value conditions the total surplus production, and then it's reverted back as profit through to the rates of profit and so on. It's a totality concept. It's not an experience. There's no experience of surplus. So you can use that concept and organizations that take it into consideration in a pragmatic way to be displaced from your experience. But you can also use surplus value to think that you know the world exactly from where you are and say, I already know how this works. It's surplus value. That's it, right? And you don't need to do anything else. So our idea is that theory functions as like we could call it like a emblem or a concept or an idea. I mean, the term that I prefer is an ideal or as an idea, even though it's the same concept, right? So one concept or form can bring you out of your experience towards something else, or it can actually become an ideal for your experience itself. And usually it's the two things at the same time. Why is this important for us? Because for us, one of the consequences of peripherization is the following. Didn't we say that the social space becomes more fractured, and fractured in all the ways we described? At different places, different aspects of community, institution, and economy have different roles to play, so on and so forth. What happens with this is that, let's say there is this sort of very crazy social space like this, right? Things don't really add up. Perhaps here there is some commonality, whatever. You have a concept that at some moments, so there's a concept here. Until some previous moment when this thing was more unified, right? This concept helped you to see the totality, right? So it mapped you into the totality. The moment that there is no longer this, and these fragments are not homogeneous, and you cannot say that because it was valid for one case, it's valid for everything. The same concept is just telling you that you are at the center of a totality, which is exactly what an ideal is. Like, keep on going, you're on the right path, just follow the prescription, you're going the right way. So even though nothing changed at the level of theory, and the theories are still nice and solid and interesting, there are many interesting things, theories can become emblems for identification, even though they're not capable of doing anything. So our idea is to show that the social space can change, and that can make theories ineffective. And the more the theories become ineffective, the more the only effect they have is localizing you in the space, right? So you are here.
Like
The
flat
Okay.
example you used, right?
Yeah, it goes very nicely with the flattening. Yeah. Sorry, Carol.
Yeah, it goes nicely with the flattening. It's kind of the theory of the idleness of theories, right?
Yeah, like, it's a bit like that. So, for example,
when a certain wheel of the machine just turns in false, like it's still turning. You think it's doing something, but it's doing nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, something like this. Exactly. The idea is that ultimately there is a correlation between effectivity, an inverse correlation between effectivity and identity. The less effectivity you have, the more you identify with the theory, or the more that's the only effectivity that it has. So the more it's able to cause something, to say something about the world, right? So I'm here, and surplus value helps me to understand why A relates to B, not me, right? I'm here. It maps something else, not about me, right? The less I can causally understand this space, the more surplus value becomes, it says something about me doing something. Or if I defend surplus value, then I'm doing this other thing. Right? So it's an idea to recuperate the problem of discursivity, but as a sort of consequence of a social economic problem. The more fragmented the social spaces are in these hybrid ways, the less clear it is if you are displacing yourself to learn something other than you, or if you are generalizing your position to the whole, right? So our basic idea is that you can kind of also include, not only use the theory to analyze the organization, but also analyze the organizational role of the theories as well, using this idea. So this leads finally to these two perspectives. It's not very nicely distinguished. I think I might actually redo it. It's the idea here is the following. Yeah, let me do it here. In the case where this reduction has a central place, what tends to happen is like I have different perspectives they're all self-consistent, right? They're all very internally consistent critique of based on community, based on institutions, based on economy. I can use them to view. Sorry, how was this constructed? I just forgot. Yeah, it's actually starts with the experience, right? So you can actually start with, let's say, my experience suggests. I'll use this thing here. Why not? Let me just see if I can make it bigger.
Oh, I can read it. No problem with that.
Okay, just a bit weird for me. Okay, so the idea is this: like, imagine you have 3 different experiences here, right? From this point of view, this analysis of communitarian perspective is more cogent, it's more immediate. For this other perspective here, the institutional one tends to be more clear. And for this other one here, for some reason, the economic perspective is clearer, right? They actually give different perspectives on the social structure, and each one of them is kind of consistent. They seem to look at everything. There's nothing that they're not looking at. Because as we talked about...
They provide complete coverage of the space. Like,
yeah, exactly.
And
once you look in terms of resolutions, resolutions cover everything, right?
Yeah.
So you will never be able to tell a guy who's only looking in these terms, or mostly in these terms, that he forgot something. He covered everything. The guy who was looking institutionally in triadic terms, he also covered everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the guy who's looking in the quaternary terms, he also covered everything. So there is no way to say, I can help you because there's something incomplete in your vision. But the weird thing, and this is the kind of the last kind of jump we're proposing, is that these self-consistent views, they by definition can only be defining parts of this totality. Whereas this other idea here, where my experience, this other guy's experience, and this other guy's experience, they're not compatible. They are forced to transit between these different logics. This will create a big mess of a contradiction in terms of how organizations relate, how organizations are built, and so on. But this contradiction, it actually is mapping something real. Because this contradiction between C, I, and E, it's actually a miniature of the contradiction between nation, state, and capital. So even though these guys were more consistent, in their very consistency, they didn't map a certain higher level of complexity of our social formation. They map, let's say, consistent views, but leave out the messy commonness. Whereas these guys who are tangled in a problem, tangled in things that don't work, tangled in trying to bring together perspectives that are not really making sense together, they are actually capturing something about what doesn't make sense in the social formation itself.
So the way you are framing this is that the first ones are kind of, they are in possession of a complete theory of, I don't know, the social world, while the other ones are enmeshed in I'd say a practical problem. And the practical problem is forcing them to kind of compatibilize things that might seem incompatible, and this might yield a more complete picture of the social world because of its contradictions.
Yeah. So we get back to, I mean, I'm a Hegelian at the end, right? So the contradictions are true, right? So there are contradictions here, things are crazy, but this contradiction might be a sign of something contradictory in the social formation, right? But it's not a theory of contradiction, like, oh my God, contradiction is the beautiful thing. It's like
it's ontological contradiction. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's like there are problems, but problems that appear because you force these logics together, they are more relevant in terms of informing about a world that is itself caught up in those problems. So this would be more complex than this.
But
right?
what is the, I would say, I would ask, what is the motivation of these different perspectives? Why the first ones, in the first graph, they are, I don't know, they think they know better than the other ones? What's the practical difference between them? Is it just that the second ones are, I don't know, militant in a certain practical way than the first?
The first thing that I would just clarify, I don't think was clear enough, is that this is individual experience. This second thing we added here, it's both theories and organization, right? So it's either a theoretical or an organizational thing. Might be the most militant thing in the world. But the fact is that because you are privileging one logic over the others, you can trust that logic to give you a higher degree of internal consistency.
I see.
Right?
So yeah, I see. So you are illustrating a property of the logics, not a property of the individuals that are necessarily adopting the logics.
No.
I see.
So
Okay.
the issue is that this form of consistent organizing, right? I'm organizing in one element, I'm using one theory to evaluate. It's the most consistent, but it's also going to have a constraint on how much information about something as crazy as this social formation it's going to be able to produce. And I think it's not only a matter of information, but a matter of causation, because it both extracts info, but it also affects, right? It negates something about that world. So it's both at the level of informational complexity, but also causal effectivity. Whereas this other model here, where people are engaged in organizations that are themselves struggling with this, they're probably going to fight like crazy. This might be many organizations. This is an ecology, right? This as well. Well, at least at this level, there's a higher chance that you can actually extract more information and have more causal power over something which is of the same order of complexity as your organization. Ultimately, the fundamental proposition that is not clear here in the book, but it's, sorry, did you say something? I know you're not talking. The ultimate proposition behind all of this is that you can only intervene at something if you have a compatible order of complexity as it. So that proposition needs to be better clarified. But the idea is that once we start looking at these multiple things and seeing that there are very sophisticated ways of thinking about their interactions, we have a chance of looking at the left as a highly complex ecosystem rather than as a simple, direct, consistent, self-sustained, idealized set of projects. And the more complex the left is, the higher the chance that it can have a capacity to intervene on something of the same order of complexity, right? So that's pretty much where we're aiming at. So that concludes the nice part. I just briefly want to say some things that we don't know already. Like we end the chapter with some critiques of ourselves because we think that's what other people will say. The first is the critique that it's too formal. I mean, it's easy to begin by talking about let's keep inside of politics and stuff, and then you come up with like a bunch of graphics and talk about logic and whatever. So we're worried about this a bit, even though I think that one classic critique of formalism we can clearly take out of the table because we didn't produce a model that tells you what to do. Like nobody will leave the reading of this book knowing what should be done, but it should augment your toolbox about how to do whatever you want to do. That's what matters, right? So it's a model more in the sense of, as we were talking about, if you're going to walk through a house you don't know the blueprint of, like a maze, and you need to coordinate with others, you don't have the blueprint. You cannot tell the recipe or the protocol for walking around. Well, all you can do is come up with, use some knowledge to know how to interpret the data you get from the space. So you can actually accumulate it in a coherent way, right? So it's more like that. The second thing is that we think that a lot of people will complain that there are a lot of categories that are important for contemporary politics that we are not using. And it could also be in contradiction with that idea of using the tools of the left to think the leftist organization. So where is gender? Where is ecology? Where is direct mentions to race? And our answer to that is that we don't think that these are homogeneous categories to begin with. And the same way that it would be a gross simplification of the Black movement to suppose that there is such a thing as the logic of the Black movement, right? It's clear that a particular Black organization based on some principle will be itself a mixture of all these things, right? And just because it makes reference to, let's say, something that concerns race or oppression doesn't mean it's not essentially anti-capitalist or institutional or whatever. So in our defense, our proposal is that we shouldn't structuralize things that are actually quite singular and that we're in need of singularizing them a bit more. So there's no reason why you should confuse Black Lives Matter in America with the Black movement in Brazil. For example, just to give you a very quick example of how these things are very nice to apply in practice. In North America, we can quite safely say that colonization created a society where you have a capitalist system, but the communities were preserved. So sorry, let me use the formalism I was using. So surely value has the central organizing force, but communities were preserved and institutions are there to preserve the separation between communities. So there is such a thing as a Black community, and the state is there to make sure that the Black community doesn't mix with the white community. It's like a very strong segregative mark. So I would write the American social formation like this. The Brazilian social formation is one where, because of economic capitalist reasons, the state was important to enclose the territory for extraction, and communities were created for the purpose of the maintenance of that state form of exploitation. So communities are not preserved, they're not subdominant. So this is a classic federative structure. In Brazil, it's a fake federation because we begin with exploitation of resources through enclosures and property law, and the communities are not historically formed. So Portuguese people were obliged to leave where they didn't want to be here. There were the slaves mixed with them. Communities that were actually a bit more like the American communities, like self-sustained and cohesive, which were indigenous tribes and things like this, that were exterminated, and only this sort of forced mixture was in place. So when you have organizations that bet on the communitarian as a basis to negate economy, right, and make use of the state to demand from the state that you will have that economic privilege negated, right? That works because the institution was at service of the community structure from the beginning. But in Brazil, that was never the case. To have an anti-capitalist movement asking of the state to negate communal segregation, it works. It doesn't go anywhere because there were no communities in that sense to begin with. So the structure of race segregation in America is more like this, and it's more like this in Brazil. That's why this might be effective there, but this is not effective here. So we can start talking about these weird things. You know, we can start opening these black boxes, and I think it's nice. And also, one thing we know people are going to complain is that where is Marx? Like, why don't we have like a big Marx thing on top? Or why don't we have like, if it's not Marx, why don't we say it's this or that, right? And the idea is precisely that we should be able to, this is almost not a political theory, it's almost like a meta-political theory. It's not really philosophy because you can use it in practice, but at the same time, it's kind of in between. Even though I think the proper term for it is communist theory. I'm not sure if you guys remember Marx's description of the communist logic in the Communist Manifesto. And he says, communists are not part of any particular, they don't have a particular party. They are just the part of every party that is engaged on the common parts of the struggle, right? So he says, there are worker parties like this, and communists are those parts of these parties that are concerned with the parts of them that go together. So for me, this is the same thing. So I place it in the same spectrum, but since Marx today functions as one of those emblems we were talking about between ideas and ideals, we thought it was better not to go into that. Finally, one thing that we are still not doing, but it's interesting, it's a possibility, is that we can use all of this to analyze the right, right? If we know that the passage from nation-state capital to the communitarian institutional economic logic of the left was done by an operation of negation, negating one, negating two, or negating three. But you could come up with a different operator that organizes the communitarian institutional and economic logic of the right.
That's quite interesting because there is kind of a rightist theory that does just that. If you read Alexander, yeah, fourth political theory, he defines like communism as the statist one, fascism as the nation one, liberalism, liberal democracies as the capitalist one, and he wants to come up with a fourth thing. But his analysis is based on a certain subject of history within these different movements, and the subject is either class, like in the communist version, either race or nationality in the fascist, I don't know, imperial one or something like that, and
people.
Yeah.
Individual, the individual.
Individual. The individual is the capitalist one, the liberal one.
Yeah, I think this would work. And I think that in Brazil, this is very important because one big mistake that we make, and I think that I mentioned this last time, right? It's actually a friend of mine and Raquel. Carol, I think you know him, Michael. Michael wrote a text. Yeah, he wrote a text that he uses this metaphor of futebol de várzea, this sort of soccer on not perfect grounds, right? And I think that there's a lot to exploit there. I mentioned this last time that I really think it's a nice image that, like, you need to adapt your tactics to the terrain. So if the terrain is very crazy and like this with the angle, if you pass the ball from here to here, it's gonna go faster than if you try from here to here. Like, you need to take the terrain into consideration, right? And I think that our analysis of the right today doesn't take the terrain into consideration. And we confuse the power of the right with the facilitations of the terrain. So sometimes it looks like things are easier from one direction than from the other, but it's more that sometimes you're treating social symptoms as political decisions. So people might be proposing things or defending things not because they're politically engaged with those things, but simply because they're reacting to specific socioeconomic conditions. If you cannot distinguish the terrain in the political game, you can ascribe power to the adversary team that is actually coming from the terrain. Oh my God, they kick the ball so strong, but it's actually the fucking terrain that is on an angle towards you. You know, like
there's also
and your goal is here.
Something that is related to the analysis of the right that I think that I thought about now, and related to Dugin, for instance, that with this logic at hand, on our hands, you might be able also to make certain relationships between fractions of the right and fractions of the left. For instance, recently I saw like this debate between Dugin and Yuhui, the Chinese guy. Yuhui didn't want to be associated at all with Dugin. He was trying to fight it. I have nothing to do with this theory, this right-wing theory of yours and all that, but they were both very appreciative of Viveiros de Castro, both of them. So how do you account for that? Like Viveiros de Castro is like a theoretical framework for both of them, for Viveiros and Yuhui. So there might be a certain commonality within a certain category of the three, but difference in other that make the disambiguation
But you
between
see, I
being
think
and
that we can explain this and saving Viveiros from the accusation of crypto-fascist by saying that everyone who is serious is interested in people who give you tools to think about the terrain. Like perspectivism is not, in my opinion, is not politically relevant, but it's socially relevant. Like it's good to have a theory of what perspectives are and how to navigate a fragmented space. Dugin is going to be interested in that as much as Yuhui, because it's not about what politically is to be done, right? Though I think that it's not really what we need.
I think it's trickier than that for Viveiros. I wouldn't so easily, but you know, I'm much more hostile to these kind of things than you, so I understand.
Yeah. But anyway, I think that, for example, Bolsonaro's government in Brazil is impossible to understand if you don't understand that he needs to get together the communitarian right focused on conservative customs with the institutional right, which has one part of it is connected to the military, but one part is connected with the strong state and so on, with the economic right, which is actually not obviously connected with the strong state because it thinks of itself as stateless or against the state, right? So there is a specific organizational intelligence needed to combine different fractions of the right, which are also navigating the same terrain as the left. So my impression is that they simply got a kickstart on this problem because they began from not having a theory of homogeneity. They began from having to organize MBL in Brazil with the military, with Paulo Guedes. Like these things don't go together. So they're
also can be accounted by the logic you exposed before of certain organizations doing certain things in order to differentiate themselves from the other ones.
Yeah, I agree.
In the right as well. So you can get these weird alliances between military and liberals and almost these anarcho-capitalists because they don't want the PT or something like that.
Yeah.
So these logic of negations can account for a lot of weird alliances as well. Yeah.
Yeah. What was I going to say? One thing that I didn't bring up, but that I think it's a very important concept, we explored it in the book as well, is this idea that when you have this situation, actually now I see that it's a principal and non-principal ultrafilter thing as well. Like when you have this, okay, so fragment A shares with B and C some common space. We call this the public space. And we call, let's say, the disposition of being oriented toward this common space, the populace, like the people. But you can also have this. There is no common part between all these things, right? So you can't, for example, the thing is, this is useful because how do you call the set of common parts of this, which never really form a public space? I think we should call it the vulgar. Because if it's the opposition between the public and the people, right? And the vulgar space and the vulgus, which is that mass, which is like the rebel or the populacho, right? The difference between these things is very clear in practice when you imagine the following. I have an idea. What do I call popularization? It's like when it circulates in a space and it can count on the homogeneity of that space to be disseminated while preserving information. The information counts the same in all spaces, right? That's what we call popularizing an idea. What do we call vulgarizing an idea? It's when an idea circulates and everyone does something with it that is different, right? Isn't that how we call like vulgarization? So
yeah,
one thing we can say is that peripheral social spaces have vulgar logics. They don't have popular logics. Popular logics are the logics when you suppose that there is some social homogeneity behind. So, for example, for people to organize inconsistent logics together or inconsistent organizations, it's a social effect that they will be vulgar. It's not an aesthetic that you're proposing. It's impossible to bind together incompatible parts of a social scenario without being vulgar to someone. So if I make my Marxist language simpler to talk to some people, it will look like I'm making a vulgar version of it to the high academics. If I try to make a religious connection, spiritual connection with evangelical church, it will look vulgar to someone else, and so on and so forth. If you try to be plastic with your customs, to debate with the more academic, custom-directed left, you will look vulgar to the communitarian peripheral community. It's impossible not to look vulgar, meaning it's impossible to guarantee that what you're doing has its information preserved across the whole social spectrum. So I think that this is actually a very profound theory to be developed, and it connects back to the right-wing thing, because all the new right-wing leaders, in my opinion, they're not populists, because I think their intelligence is precisely of abdicating the theory of the people and the theory of that there is some homogeneity. They might talk about it in those terms, but it's clear that they're more comfortable with vulgarity than we are, right? And our proposal is that vulgarity is not a political aesthetics of fascism. Vulgarity is the only ways information can circulate when you have this sort of crazy fractured social formation. It will happen no matter what.
This is also consistent with the Centrão, you know, not just Bolsonaro.
Yes,
right?
exactly. PMDB invented this, right? Even though they're more discreet, like they're not for the people, but they're not like positively vulgar, right? They try to be kind of in the background. Whereas you now have a vulgar right. And it's not, in my opinion, it's not just again, it's a matter of the terrain. It's not a matter of the game. It's not a matter of the politics you're choosing. It's a matter of the constraints you need to accept. It doesn't matter what image you come up with. And I see a lot of friends talking about, oh, if only we had a good aesthetics, we could connect with the masses. I honestly, I find this very sad, because it's clear that people who said this never had an image that was important to them totally destroyed by simply taking it to the wrong place, or was to the right place. Like the circle did this for me like for 10 years.
Yeah, you're right. But the last one was accelerationism, that now is like only Nick Land minions, you know. So
yeah,
there you go. Like a very aesthetic idea from 2013, going back to good Leninist democratic centralism, and, you know, multi-scalar analysis, and, you know, cyber scene and Chile and all of that. And now, you know, yeah, it's all Nick Land.
It was only that guy. But I think that this is and you can answer to this very easily, because what are you gonna have as your support if you cannot support yourself on your images or your ideas, because they will be vulgarized on organization? a strong enough organization, in my opinion, that's a definition. A strong enough organization is one that survives its own vulgarization. Like, if you can make fun of yourself, if you can allow yourself to be poorly seen, wrongly interpreted, that proves that you are actually on top of something else. You're not, it's not that idea, that the immaterial idea that sustains your consistency. The consistency comes from somewhere else. So I really think that we're only starting to scratch the surface on that problem, because for now it's still, it's for me the populist thing all over again. If we have the right image, it will connect all demands in the social space homogeneously, right? So that's also why the whole non-principal ultra filter that Badiou brings up, this idea of how do you cover a space that has no singleton? There's nothing in the middle that allows all these coverings to be kind of have some commonality, right? So what is a common? So what is the form? I think that's the question today for me. What is the form of the common that is not a common form? I think that's the problem, right? How do you then connect these things without supposing that okay, it's okay to remain at the local level because it's not gonna, it doesn't, because there's no social homogeneity. Local plus local doesn't equal global. It might actually cancel itself out. So we don't even have the good reasoning to be local. We are neither local nor global because local achievements might cancel each other out. And we don't know how to move towards the global. So we're totally fucked. And so how do you accept this fragmentation, but at the same time, come up with a way of constructing a perspective from which you can see these things, right? What would that mean? So I think that's kind of, it's at the level of this underlying contextual issue that we are developing this. The ultimate problem here is, should we come up with a fourth consistent, self-consistent logic like Karatani does, and say that the left is not really a negation of nation, state, and capital, as if there are like these things, right? But there's actually, let's say, these things, and you put them at the service of some other logic. You can call it whatever, right? Free association. And then when this is on top of this is communist. And when these things are on top, it's not communist. So we're not sure if we should have a fourth logic the way that Karatani does, or if we should allow that fourth logic to be constructed by the ecology of organization, slowly fermenting.
The fourth logic hypothesis, it seems to me, to have temptation.
Yeah.
Right? To go back to, you know, this ontological scheme where
I have a bit of a problem with that.
Like a Agamben thing, stuff like that, you know.
Yeah, I tend to think like that. And in the work that Dennis and I have been doing, we haven't had a need for originally defining this in order to do the rest. So I have the impression that it's okay to talk about, let's say, a sort of class of new experiments, but they might fall under the name free association, they might not. It actually is defined by the consequences more than by the specific logic they are proposing, right? I'm not sure if that's needed.
Yeah, but then the work seems to be to define kinds of consequences in a sense.
Yeah.
And to pinpoint the kinds of consequences that are of interest for constituting this form of the common.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a lot of work to move in that direction, because I tend to prefer, for now, not really saying like, and I think that in this book it wouldn't have fitted. Like, there is ample historical, material from all sorts of theoretical backgrounds to say community, institution, and capital, or state, nation, and capital. But to say that there is a fourth logic that is mixed with religion, that is at the same time an underground current, like it seems like you're, as you said, presupposing too much so that you can reveal it in the end. It seems like it might be Karatani's own problem with social homogeneity. Like, guys, don't worry. When these things crumble, there is this other thing in the background. But the way that we are proposing, I think that which I think is consistent with the work Dennis and I have been doing, the idea is that, well, you probably find out what this other thing is, if it can be called another thing, by the accumulation of information of what you're producing, right? Rather than the sort of recuperation of a previous thing. But
yeah, for instance, if the fourth logic has something to do with religious organizations, you can look at religious organizations in Brazil. I think most of them pretty much are exhausted by the three logics you just presented.
I don't see exactly. I agree with Karatani that there seems to be something specific about the sort of transcending a system. That seems to be itself something different than what you learn by these other things. But yeah, I'm not convinced that this is necessary. Anyway, we managed to write this chapter without having it there, but we just found it sufficient without it. But I mean, I know it was a lot, but I hope the relations with the stuff we've been doing here are clear enough. You know, I did still a lot of stuff of discussions with all of you, in fact, when we were writing the book. So yeah. That's it.
I mean, it's extremely relevant. I feel like I'm gonna use all this stuff soon. So
yeah, I think that especially in the stuff we're doing now, I hope you can also see that it's the things we need to develop right now. Like we went as far as showing that you can organize capitalism in a multi-layered way, that you can talk about composition and scaling and things like this to discuss capitalist categories. And we went as far as saying, I think, in our kind of tree of modes of transformation, right, that there are, let's say, singular ways of reindexing stuff that is both situated but has a bearing on the transcendental. So that seems to be like the starting point. We are ending right now where this chapter is kind of exploring, but in a much more informal way, right? So, but we're in close territory, I think.
yeah, I mean, I think this idea of like uneven terrain is really good, and as well as this ecology of organizations. I think they're related.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And also, I mean, I think that it's a good test for the stuff we're doing with the Marx stuff, because we are not, I mean, since from the very building blocks of that reconsideration, we are using this theory of layers, and things don't need to be homogeneous throughout the whole terrain. You can have a localizational logic that doesn't really cover everything at once. It seems compatible, like it seems from the very beginning already compatible with that, right? And
yeah,
and it's also compatible with that other principle, which I think is the central one, which is if this chapter is suggesting that organizations can produce new information, right? They are experiments in some sense about a terrain you cannot clearly know. That seems to go very nicely together with the idea that capitalism is a constrained look on the social world, and you can have there is information that doesn't fit into that form of organization, right? So what in our new Marxist perspective counts as novelty, right, through Badiou, from this other perspective, which is more, let's say, from the inside of organization, this new thing should appear in two ways: causation and information, right? Producing new ways of depending, new ways that organizations can depend on one another, So cause each other, constrain each other, right? But also new resolutions through which to extract more information. So I think that this whole construction we're doing there gives us actually more formal tools to conceptualize what we could mean by information when talking about organization and what we could mean by causation. Because from the perspective that I just presented, these two things are very loose, right? They don't really mean anything.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge. Like,
yeah,
normally with an experiment, you go into it with a hypothesis, right? You go into it with some kind of thing to be validated or invalidated. And with an organization, it's like, it seems like the clearest or the only thing is whether or not the organization survives.
Yeah, I think that, again, like survival is a good criteria. Producing constraints on other things in the world is a different criteria. But it's all kind of connected with the way that certain principles and logics are interacting in its form, right? So if you find out that a totally negative, warlike communal eruption, right? People are not even connected. They're just waging a war, direct war on a situation. That they produce effects that are irreversible, that actually constrain other things in the world. You might be willing to say, okay, so this tells us something about what is effective, right? That is,
Yeah.
So there are many ways to bring this into play, but I think that the very idea of effectivity, of extracting information, and of, you know, what does it mean to cause something when you are an organization? It's quite easy, for example, in the institutional level, because it's the representational level, and it's the level where, you know, a law has been passed. So you say, well, our interests were represented. But at the economic level, talking about constraints and talking about causation is not that simple, even though strikes are a very good model for a discussion. I hope that I plan in the future to like do this one meeting only on the structure of strikes, because I think that they really clarify a lot about what we're talking about. But it's not always that easy, right? And it's difficult to have a concept of causation, constraints, information that is ample enough to both be politically relevant, so to tell us something about social political reality, but also plastic enough to accommodate all those differences, right? So, yeah, but that's I think next, the future of this stuff, you know?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really good. We'll need to think about it.
And I hope, I'm really glad that the internet didn't really crash today. I feel less paranoid from now on. It would be amazing if you guys, like, it broke the whole thing, you just didn't say anything, just so I wouldn't be sad.
Yeah.
We've been talking on a private chat about that.
Yeah.
We've been trying to piece together what you've been saying. I think you said this, like, maybe you did this.
Yeah, guys, so this is it. Actually, we're signing a contract with Pluto Press to publish this in English as well. So it should be available in English sometime by the end of next year, I imagine. Yeah. Anyway, I know it's late for everyone, so probably we should.
Tomorrow we have that live show to do.
Yeah, tomorrow.
Yeah, oh my God.
I'm kind of worried. I've never been to a live show with 5 other interviewees. Like, it seems messy, but yeah.
I need to add you to a group. See how I can do it. Because they're creating a group. I think Rafael created a group to everyone who's presenting to talk a bit beforehand, so we can coordinate.
Yeah, I have no idea about presenting anything, you know, I just was invited, but yeah, 5 different people, like 2 hours, it seems a lot, you know, I don't know.
Yeah. Gabriel, just one thing, you don't have to answer this now because it's too late, but I was thinking, when you presented the 3 logics, the quaternary logic is the only one that is open. the other ones are closed. I don't
Yeah.
know if it makes any difference for you, this, but you can answer this another time. But
No, I think it's easy. It's not as weird as it seems. It's just this idea that that in commodity exchange, right? The relation is not between people, right? The relation is between things.
Yeah,
So,
no.
So at this level, you have a relation, but at this level here of the bearers of commodity, you don't have a relation, right? So here there is no relation.
Yeah, but how can I say this? I don't know if it does, if it makes any difference that, because the fact that there isn't any relation there is the exact concept of fetishism for Marx.
Yeah, but this is important because I don't think it's purely fetishism. Imagine the following situation, right? These people here, they share some institution, right? So these two also go here, and they also have some personal ties, these two, right? And they have absolutely no relation with these other people here who also have personal ties, but they are totally distinct, disjunct, right? And some institution here that connects them as well, right? Well, why is commodity relation a more an adequate relation for composing larger worlds? Because though these people don't connect, these things might connect, and they remain disconnected. So you see, in a non-socially homogeneous world, where there are fragments like this, commodities can circulate while people are trapped in this space.
Yeah.
So it is important, in my opinion, to clarify why this is not purely fetishism in the sense that you're not seeing, but you're actually related. So even if you do see that commodities are related, the fact that you're not related at this level allows things for capital that other forms cannot do. Like it can cross bridges that states and communities cannot. So this is also why, this is also why in a socially fragmented world like ours, right, coming up with structures that allow people not to relate only through mediation might actually be the only way to construct this common form. Because you're not going to create a community
that's a good point, yeah.
brings all of them, right?
Yeah.
This idea of the vulgus seems structurally very similar to the.
Yeah, I think that what would be a vulgar money, that would be something that capitalism cannot think. Like, I'm just putting it out there. But like, you see my point? Like, once you have this crazy structures like this, only thing that circulates is not value and it's not loss. It's the only thing that circulates is commodity, because they respect the impersonal ties between people. They don't connect people, right? But the thing about commodities is that they're all mapped onto a singleton, which is money. That's still a limitation, right? But I think it's important to clarify this lack of relation, lack of personal relation, because we might need to think about other options that also have this quality, right? Mediations that still preserve the lack of relation in some level. Because those, clarify.
I was just thinking if this quaternary logic is maybe not homogeneous with the ternary logic, you know, but with this explanation, I think it's better.
Yeah, I for example, there are places where commodity exchange is happening under particular state. Sometimes it's happening under international law. Sometimes it's happening totally illegally, right? For example, in Brazil, there's a very important phenomenon that I think anthropologists of economy study, which is a lot of the distribution of important commodities like Coke bottles or candy or some very obvious popular consumables, right? they're done illegally. Like people go to the door of the factory and they take a lot of bottles and they resell them without being an official distributor, with no contract, with no nothing.
Mhm.
Because you can't make the commodity circulate if you're purely respecting the law. So there are situations where commodities do circulate outside of the law. It's not simply between laws, right?
Mhm.
Uh,
Oh, that's right.
so, I mean, how do we come up? I mean, I think this helps to put the scenario into place, the landscape, and then you can ask, okay, this is the terrain. What would be a mediation, a new form of mediation, for example, that is able to do what commodity and money can do, but without the sort of intrinsic relation to state and nation that money has, right? So you can start complexifying the question that we've been interested in other meetings about alternatives to money, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The crisis of both like media and science also makes a lot of sense of like the problem of fake news and the problem of
Yeah, I think
trust
it really
science,
fits.
like, because they both assume this hypothesis of homogeneity and of of being this really rigid form of universal way of propagating that is not available anymore.
Yeah, and I think that it's the more perplexed we are, the more obvious it is that we didn't know what we were doing, like how much we depended on a particular social formation or social logic, because it's so obvious that scientific knowledge should propagate automatically, that there are no social conditions for being removed from your experience to consider scientific knowledge as an idea, that once that falters, you say, "Oh my God, these people are so stupid." But I'm very much obsessed with flat Earth uh, conspiracy, because do you realize how perfect a symptom it is, right? It selects a small space where the space is actually Euclidean, and then it says, "Well, all space is like this, for fuck's sake." Of course it is, right? And it is, and when we come to complain about it, we say, no, dude, the earth is not flat, right? And we want to suggest that this is a better picture of the world. But this picture of the world, the guy can actually like relate to his experience, and he can actually generalize on his own. Whereas this one, you're asking him to dogmatically accept, and you don't even know why it's not working anymore. You think it's not working because he's stupid, and he knows ultimately that you don't know why this is so. Like most spherical earthers that I know of, the way that they defend that the earth is not flat is by saying that there is a picture. So like the same postmodern media theory critic guys who say pictures are social constructs, when you put them against the wall and say, how do you know the earth is not flat? They say, look at the picture. Like they don't know that the earth is not flat. They believe that it is not flat. That's a belief that works for them. And even though in their life, nothing, not only that they usually, and used to mean myself as well, like we don't really know how to explain or how to prove the earth is not flat, even though there are some means to do it. But not only we don't know that, but the knowledge that you could use to prove that the earth is not flat has no use for you at all in your life. So I think the flat earth thing is actually quite emblematic of a sort, I call it the Euclidean conspiracy, you know? It's just supposing that the laws of space in the local is the laws of space in the global. And that's how the left works. So, I mean, I have sympathy.
There's a kind of skeptical Wittgensteinian version of this. Like it's in the Derek Jarman movie. Don't know if you remember that. Wittgenstein is giving a class, and
I love this.
Some student says, and I think it's Wittgenstein who asks a student, why do we think that the sun revolves around the earth? And then the student responds, well, because it surely looks like that. And then Wittgenstein asks, how would it look if it was the other way around? And he was, oh, Like some aspects of his whole life is changed by this simple observation.
Yeah, but I like, yeah, I think there's a profound truth in this. And I think that fake news, conspiracy, which is very much a way of connecting local to global while preserving our place, right? Because this is one of the aspects that is complicated about this social situation, which is the more you lose the ground to say your experience is public or your experience is common, you need something to guarantee your social place. At the same time, you want to map the whole. So you use the same thing for both. The thing that maps you on your place also should map the whole.
Yeah,
That's what conspiracies do.
Yeah, I see the same reflex in, you know, conservative people with us. It's actually the opposite. Like they turn to a kind of scientism because, for instance, of gender theories. So
Yeah.
now science is all right, you know, because science says there's male and female. Shut up. So
Yeah, it's very pick and choose.
yeah, it's like the same thing. Like my parents, you see, it's like the same thing. Like,
but science doesn't say that, also, right? Like,
no,
science doesn't say that there's like male, like there's two genders, right?
No, but
or two sexes, right?
This is what I said is scientism, not science, right?
Yeah.
It's like a vulgarization of science, of certain, I don't know, past science or something like that, you know.
Yeah, but I think that this idea of vulgarization really
view,
works.
or a certain view that certain sect of a certain appropriation of biology, misguided appropriation of biology, is a kind of a vulgar scientism.
Yeah, I think that, again, vulgarity is a nice term to think as the operation where, rather than the private goes towards the public, right? The public localizes the private, to use the Badiou lingo. So I put my private interests on hold from the perspective of something which is supposedly common. It's the inverse. You put the common stuff, you localize them from the private perspective. So it's not even private, because it's not exactly about private life, but it's about these fragments, right? Or this social hybrid situation. So they're all relocalized according to different structures based on where you are. So for one place, you will pick and choose parts of science, part of religion, part of politics, and so on. And then in another place, you pick and choose different aspects of that common heritage, right?
Yeah, it's like this pick and choose aspect. Yeah, absolutely.
And I just think that
you see the same ideological pole among, for instance, new atheists. Like you see the people like Sam Harris, this kind of people, like, oh no, it's all about science, and it's very vulgarized, very simplified science.
Yeah. So my point is that I think that we should use all these tools to analyze the left. So where is the resistance to vulgarization? What does it do for the left? Can we see ourselves as a bunch of fragments that don't really go together for structural reasons and so on? And my impression is that the moment that you make this perspective shift, the left becomes a sort of miniature laboratory where we can start convincing people that we are interesting, not because of what we say, but because we're able to do. So you say, like, look, here we managed to do something different. So this is a proof that we can do it elsewhere. You don't need to convince people that their lives are wrong and they could be right. You first say that you are as wrong as they are, and then you fix your side. That's a different way of convincing people than saying your lives are all shit, it should be different. Because who said that there is the social conditions to arrive at this other place? You didn't try it. So I think it's also a way of totally shifting around. I mean, it goes very well with that text Renzo linked a long time ago about meme as politics, and this idea that
comment on that,
yeah, it's a really nice text, and it has this very basic assumption right at the beginning, right? This proposition that the left knows radical actors, but not radical actions today. We don't know how to evaluate if an action is radical. And I think that this is, at least, it might be a humble thing. I think that if you compare with the challenges we have today, to say, let's change the left, therefore it will be something nice. It might be a bit deceiving, and it's not that simple, but or not that it's not sufficient, but it's at least the idea of a different principle of how to evaluate radical action. Because, well, if this was actually changed, it's easier to suggest to people that it is possible. It's possible not in the future, it's possible now, right? It was changed. That's why it has consequences. It's not that it has consequences because it will change. So it's also politics without future, which I think it's a good thing, because if we could go into this, but there's a definite reason why we talk about the end of the future. In my opinion, is clearly a symptom of the lack of social homogeneity, crisis of development, the platypus social formation which we spoke about. I think, I mean, Carol knows this. I like Mark Fisher, but not that much. I think Chico de Oliveira is like 10 times better than Mark Fisher for this stuff. Like, we knew about the end of the future very early on, and I think we can make peace with that a bit better than people in England. But it also connects to that, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, I
Should we rename ourselves to the subset of theoretical platypus?
Technological.
Yeah, I like, well, but nothing, I mean, we didn't even mention Bogdanov, but I mean, doesn't technology just fit so perfectly into the idea of a bunch of fractured terrains like in friction with each other?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
Yeah, so I mean,
technological.
Speaking of which,
shifts.
like, what's the reading for next week? Like, you were talking about 2 versions of the text, so
I'll write down on the group there, but I think we should just read the first chapter called "What is Organizational Science?" Like 30
but
pages.
we should use the same PDF, right? So
Yeah, it's the
just
essays on technology and not
Okay.
the technology book one. It's essays on tech. I'll post the PDF and the reading there.
Okay.
Okay, guys, I need to run. It's ridiculously late. But thank you so much for being so welcoming to this, especially after my trauma yesterday.
It's great. Yeah.
See you guys.
Take care, everyone.
Bye bye.